Here is something that shouldn't make sense. The reason we can still read words written more than 5,000 years ago is because someone's house burned down. Not metaphorically, literally. Some of the oldest archives in human history survived because the buildings around them caught fire. The flames superheated the air and accidentally transformed fragile clay tablets into something closer to ceramic than mud. Without that fire, those tablets would have dried, cracked, eroded, and eventually dissolved back into the earth. But because of the fire, they became astonishingly durable. The very thing we associate with the destruction of knowledge became, under the right circumstances, the reason that knowledge survived. And that paradox sits at the heart of nearly everything we know about the earliest written records ever created. But here is the part that keeps archaeologists awake at night. For every archive that burned in exactly the right way, there were probably countless others that did not. Some fires burned too hot, others burned too slowly. Some buildings collapsed before the tablets could harden. Some archives were looted, abandoned, buried by floods, or simply left exposed to centuries of rain and wind. Entire collections of human knowledge may have vanished without leaving the slightest trace. The oldest written records we possess are not a complete picture of the ancient world. They are a survival sample, a fraction of a fraction, a tiny collection of documents filtered through fire, flood, chance, and the indifferent mathematics of which pieces of clay happen to end up in the right soil, at the right depth, waiting thousands of years for someone to uncover them. And within that gap lies a mystery, a gap between what was written and what survived, between what survived and what has been discovered, between what has been discovered and what has been translated, and finally, between what has been translated and what we truly understand. That gap is what this story is really about. The question sounds simple, but it isn't. What did the earliest archives choose to record? And just as importantly, what didn't they record? What knowledge never made it onto clay at all? What stories disappeared before they were ever written down? What names, beliefs, traditions, and memories were considered too ordinary, too dangerous, or too obvious to preserve? When you walk into a modern library, you are surrounded by choices. Someone decided which books to acquire. Someone decided which books to display. Someone decided which books were no longer worth keeping. The world's first archives were no different, except the people making those decisions lived in a world where writing itself was new. Every mark pressed into wet clay carried a cost in labor, time, skill, and resources. They were not recording everything. They were recording what they believed mattered most. And what they believed mattered most tells us something profound about who they were. But it also leads to a far more difficult question. What did they believe mattered least? Because the history we inherit is not simply the story of what survived. It is also the story of everything that didn't. And tonight, we are going to explore both. Not with certainty, because certainty is not something the archaeological record is generous with. This is evidence-first territory. We will deal in probabilities, cautious interpretations in what the tablets suggest rather than what they prove. Some of the most important things we can learn from the earliest archives are not the things that are written on them. They are the shapes of the silences, the categories of information that are conspicuously absent, the topics that appear once and never again, the names that show up in one archive and vanish from every other. The gaps are data too if you know how to read them. We are going to move through the earliest known archives in rough chronological order. We will start in Uruk, a city in what is now southern Iraq, where writing appears to have been invented not for poetry or prayer or philosophy, but for something considerably more mundane. We will move to Ebla in modern Syria, a palace archive of nearly 17,000 tablets that no one knew existed until 1974, preserved almost perfectly because the palace burned. We will stop at Nineveh, where an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal collected texts from across the ancient world with an obsessive intensity that would not look out of place in a modern university library, and where a city's destruction in 612 CE accidentally, guaranteed that his collection would outlast every empire that came after. And we will spend time at Hattusa, in central Turkey, the capital of the Hittite Empire, where archives were kept in multiple languages simultaneously, where treaties were written in duplicate and sent to foreign kings, and where some tablets have been sitting in museum storage for over a century and still have not been fully translated. Each of these places was one point the edge of the known recorded world. Each of them kept records. Each of them also kept secrets, or at least kept silence on certain subjects. And in some cases, we can figure out why. Other cases, we genuinely cannot tell whether something was never written down or simply has not been found yet. That distinction matters enormously, and we will try to be honest about which situation we are in at every step. If you are listening to this while you are trying to sleep, first of all, that is exactly why I make these. So before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is there. Look at those comments, and there is something I find remarkable about it. Someone in Nairobi is listening at sunrise, while someone in Vancouver is drifting off just after midnight. Both of them are thinking about clay tablets from 5,000 years ago. That is its own kind of archive, proof that curiosity does not sleep on a schedule. And if you would rather listen without any interruptions at all, you can follow the show on Spotify. No ads, no music underneath the words, just the stories. The link is in the description, and if you want to support the work directly, that is in there too. It makes a real difference, and it means more of these can keep getting made. Now, back to the fire, because the fire is not just a metaphor, and it is not just a preservation mechanism, it is a lens. Time a building burned in the ancient Near East, and left behind a layer of ash, carbonized debris, and accidentally kiln-fired clay, created a time capsule, a frozen moment. The tablets that survived are the ones that happened to be in that building on that particular day, which means what we know about the earliest human record-keeping is shaped as much by the accidents of ancient violence and architectural collapse as by any deliberate choice the scribes themselves made. We are reading the archive that fire allowed us to read, not necessarily the archive that was somewhere in that difference. In that gap between what existed and what endured is one of the most important open questions in the history of human knowledge. What did the world's oldest archives refuse to record? How would we even know? Start with the clay itself, because the clay is where everything begins and where most of it ends. The tablets used in the earliest archives were not manufactured objects in any industrial sense. They were handfuls of alluvial mud, shaped by a scribe, palm into a rough cushion, or lens shape small enough to hold in one hand, smooth enough on one face to receive impressions from a reed stylus. When you were done writing, you set the tablet down and let it dry in the air. That was it. No no firing, no deliberate hardening. The result was a dried mud object that could hold its shape for years, decades even, under the right conditions, but was fundamentally vulnerable to moisture, to pressure, to being dropped on a stone floor. These were working documents, not monuments. The people making them were not thinking about 5,000 years from now. They were thinking about the end of the fiscal quarter. The tablets were stored in ways that reflect that functional thinking. Shelves, mostly wooden shelves, that have long since rotted away, leaving behind only the ghost evidence of their existence in the arrangement of fallen tablets on excavated floors. Tablets were also kept in baskets in ceramic jars, sealed with clay stoppers bundled together, with other tablets covering the same transaction, or the same person, or the same year. Larger archives had clay envelopes, called boule-sealed containers, that held smaller tokens, or documents inside. The out-stamped with a summary of the contents could check the outside without breaking the seal. If you needed to verify what was actually inside, you broke it open. Some boule have been found, with their contents still intact. Others were broken in antiquity and left open, the seals gone, the inner tokens lost, the context permanently compromised. At Ebla, at Nineveh, at Hattusa, the shelving systems were sophisticated enough that tablets were sometimes labeled with clay tags indicating their contents. There were what appeared to be rudimentary catalogues, lists of lists. Scribes knew where things were. The archives were not random accumulations, they were organized systems with internal logic, which means, when those buildings burned, they did not just burn randomly. They collapsed along the lines of their organization, shelves toppling into each other, jars shattering, baskets carbonizing and dropping their contents in rough piles, that archaeologists can still read centuries later, the ghost of the original filing system. Now, here is the thing about fire that nobody fully appreciates until they think carefully about materials science. Unfired clay is porous and water-soluble. It dries into a brittle matrix that will dissolve back into mud given enough moisture and enough time. But fire changes the internal structure of clay permanently. The silicate minerals fuse, the organic matter burns away. Result is something closer to ceramic, harder and far more water-resistant than the original tablets that survived the burning of Ebla's palace around 2300 BCE. Survived precisely because the palace burned intensely enough to fire them where they lay. They were not rescued. They were not intentionally preserved. They were accidentally ceramicized by someone else's catastrophe, and then covered by rubble which kept them from eroding, which kept them from being robbed, which kept them from being reused. They sat there for 4,000 years, waiting for 2 Italian archaeologists to dig them up in the 1970s. That is the survival mechanism that works. Fire, followed by rapid burial. The temperature matters. The speed matters. Tablets that burned too hot, shattered. Tablets that burned too slowly, in lower temperatures, may have partially fired on one face, and remained fragile on the other. And tablets that did not burn at all, but instead sat in buildings that were abandoned and left, open to the weather, followed a very different and much less promising trajectory. Water is the primary enemy. Not dramatic flooding necessarily, but just ordinary moisture cycling through soil over centuries. Clay that alternately wets and dries tends to expand and contract until it fractures. Salt is a secondary enemy, particularly in the alluvial soils of southern Mesopotamia, where groundwater is often heavily mineralized. Salt crystals forming inside the clay matrix as moisture evaporates can push tablets apart from the inside over time, process called salt efflorescence, and it is responsible for the destruction of enormous quantities of material that was never fired. There are tablet fragments in museum collections right now that are actively disintegrating from salt damage that began the moment they were excavated and started drying in open air for the first time in millennia. Looting is an older problem. The ancient Near East had a long tradition of recycling building materials, including clay tablets. A fire tablet is a brick. Brick is a building material. There is evidence at multiple sites that earlier occupants of a location dug through older layers and used whatever they found as fill or construction material, without any awareness of or concern for what was written on it. This is not vandalism in any meaningful moral sense. It is just people building houses, but it means that an unknowable quantity of written material was literally built into later structures, pulverized or carted off to locations that have never been excavated and may never be. And then there is deliberate recycling of a different kind. Unfired clay tablets could simply be smoothed over and reused. A scribe who needed a fresh surface and had no new clay handy could wet an old tablet, work the impressions back to smoothness, and write something new. This happened. We know it happened because some tablets show traces of earlier text beneath the surface layer, ghost impressions from a previous use. That was not quite successfully erased. Tablet that was recycled. This way represents a document that is gone. Not burned, not dissolved, simply written over because someone needed the clay more than they needed the old record. All of this creates what researchers call survival bias. But in the context of archives, the term needs careful definition because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The first level is physical. What materials survived the conditions of burial? The second level is archaeological. What materials survived in locations that were eventually excavated? The third level is institutional. What materials that were excavated ended up in conditions where they could be studied rather than in unsorted storage or in private collections. The fourth level the one that shapes almost everything we think we know about ancient writing, is interpretive tablets that were found and are available for study, which have actually been read, translated, and published. Trust. The answer to that last question is considerably more humbling than most people expect. Hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been excavated. Somewhere between half and two-thirds of them, depending on which estimate you trust, never been fully published or translated. Some have been sitting in museum storage since the 19th century, which means the picture we currently have of ancient Mesopotamian record-keeping is itself a sample of a sample of a sample, filtered through accidents of fire and soil chemistry, and funding and academic priorities and institutional access. And what we think the ancient world was keeping records about is shaped by all of that, not just by what the ancient scribes actually decided to write. This is why it matters to be precise about categories. An archive is not the same thing as a library. In the ancient Near East, the distinction is real, and it affects what you find in each. An archive is an institutional record collection. It stores documents generated by specific administrative activity, receipts, contracts, land grants, ration lists, labor tallies, correspondence between officials. The tablets in an archive were created for practical purposes and stored because they might need to be referenced again. They are not meant to be read for pleasure or education. They are files. A library in the ancient sense is something closer to what Ashurbanipal was building at Nineveh, a deliberate collection of texts chosen for their intellectual or ritual content. Omen series, medical texts, literary compositions, mythological narratives, linguistic reference works. Someone made decisions about what belonged. Someone acquired copies. It is curated rather than accumulated. A temple record room is a third thing entirely. It holds ritual calendars offering lists, hymns, prayers, records of divine property, texts generated by religious practice rather than by commercial or administrative activity. The distinctions blur at the edges, as distinctions always do, but they matter because they predict very different kinds of silences. An archive will tell you nothing about cosmology. A library may tell you nothing about grain prices. Temple record room may tell you nothing about either, but will tell you in exquisite detail how many sheep were given to the god on the 14th day of a month that no longer has a name. What survived is not a representative sample of all of that. It is whatever happened to be in whatever building, burned at whatever angle, on whatever day. Which means the oldest written records we can read are to an uncomfortable degree. Written not by the scribes but by the fire. The archives survived by breaking, and what broke determined what we know to see how deep that fire-written bias goes. You have to go back to the point where archives themselves started to become necessary. Takes us to southern Mesopotamia, to the city that later myths would remember as the place where kingship descended from heaven, Uruk. Put it on a rough timeline, around 3,500 to 3,300 BCE, in what archaeologists call the late Uruk period. This settlement on the Euphrates plain was turning into something qualitatively new. Estimates are always debated, but we are probably looking at tens of thousands of inhabitants, fields and canals stretching outward for kilometer, monumental temples and administrative buildings rising in packed mud brick. Euro is very likely the largest urban center on Earth at this moment, and with that scale comes a new kind of logistical headache. You can manage a village with memory and gossip. You can manage a small temple with a handful of elders who remember who brought which goat last in spring. But when you feed hundreds of workers daily, when grain comes in from dozens of canal-fed fields, when herds of sheep and cattle belong not to a household, but to an institution, memory is not enough. Oral or accounting breaks at exactly the point Uruk reaches. The solution that took shape there is what we now call proto-cuneiform. It appears first around 3,332, 100 BCE, and by about 3,100 BCE, it is being used intensely across the city. Tablets come mostly from two major areas: the Ayana precinct associated with temple institutions, the called tablet house in the city's administrative quarter. Thousands of pieces of clay, each holding a few minutes of one scribe's working day. And what those tablets show, almost obsessively, is a world made out of quantities. Typical Uruk text is not a story. It is a list. Grain rations issued to named or classified workers. Deliveries of barley from field X to storehouse Y. Counts of sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, sometimes divided into categories by age or sex. Inventories of jars of oil, baskets of dates, fish by the hund, wool by the weight unit, lists of teams assigned to specific jobs, canal dredging, temple construction, weaving, brewing. A standard tablet might have several columns, one with a personal name or a profession sign, weaver, brewer, driver, overseer, another with a numeric notation, often using a base 60 system in embryonic form, another with the commodity barley, beer, wool, bread, sometimes a temporal marker, per day, per month for the festival, sometimes a notation that looks like an institution name or an office. It is in modern terms, institutional accounting, payroll, warehouse logs, resource allocation tables. A few tablets show more complex operations, tallies of debits and credits across a period, breakdowns of work groups, allocations of raw material to workshops and finished goods coming back in. But the core is always the same. Someone somewhere wanted to make sure that the flow of goods in and out of the great houses of Uruk could be tracked, audited. What is striking is not that they recorded things. Human groups had been using clay tokens, notched bones and tally sticks for millennia. What is new is that the recording system in Uruk suddenly becomes dense enough and standardized, enough that we can call it writing, even if it is writing in a very narrow sense. The signs on protoform tablets are still mostly pictorial. A stylized fish stands for fish, stylized head for persons, a jar shape for oil or beer. Over time, those pictures are rotated, simplified, pushed by the shape of the stylus into wedges. But at this early stage, they still retain some visual connection to what they mean. The problem for us is that meaning is not always obvious. Proto-cuneiform uses several hundred different signs. Some refer directly to objects. Some refer to abstract categories, offices, or institutions. Some are purely numerical, or serve as metrological signs, marking what counting system is being used. Volume, weight, area, capacity. Many can be used in more than one way, functioning as a concrete noun in one context, and as a classifier or unit in another. There is no grammar, as we would usually define it. Sentences do not unfold across the tablet with verbs and subjects and clear syntactic markers. Instead, there are clusters of signs arranged in columns and rows, X persons, Y grain, Z time. The reader in Uruk did not need the connecting words. They understood the administrative formula behind the shorthand. For us trying to reconstruct those formula 5,000 years later, the system is much harder to penetrate. This is why protoiform is still only partly readable. It is not that there is some dramatic hidden revelation being concealed. It is a technical and linguistic challenge. Later, Mesopotamian scribes were kind enough to leave us bilingual dictionaries and lexical lists, long tablets that explain which sign could stand for which word, how to interpret complex logs, how to convert between number systems, tools. Those tools, plus thousands of overlapping tablets from slightly later periods, when writing was closer to full language, allows seriologists to work backwards. But in the Uruk phase, we are dealing with a notation system that predates most of the sections those later texts describe. Some signs changed meaning over time. Some dropped out of use entirely. Some numerical systems used in Uruk, for example, specialized counts for grain versus animals versus people, do not map neatly onto later schemes, and context is often missing. A tablet with just a heading sign, a list of numbers, conclusion line, is perfectly legible to a temple official who already knows which project is being audited this month. To us, it is bare skeleton. We can say these are barley rations to workers. We often cannot say what work exactly, under whose authority for which institutional purpose. On top of that, the corpus itself is uneven. Excavations at Uruk, especially in the early 20th century, uncovered thousands of tablets. Current estimates run to more than 5,000 proto-cuneiform pieces from Uruk alone. Additional early tablets from sites like Jemdet Naza, Susa, and Godtape that use related systems. Path from excavation to decipherment is long and irregular. Many pieces are fragmentary. Many were taken to museum collections in Europe and the Middle East, where they sat for decades before being catalogued in detail. Some of the fundamental work on protoforms, sign lists, and numerical systems was not done until the late 20th century, and it continues now. New joins are made between fragments. Digital imaging reveals faint impressions that had been missed. Comparative studies with slightly later, better understood cuneiform help clarify older uses. At the same time, large portions of the material remain unpublished or are only available in specialist corpora that few people outside the field ever see. The result is a layered opacity. First, the ancient scribes wrote in a system that assumed a shared institutional context, instead of explicit grammar. Second, physical tablets have survived in fragmentary selective ways. Third, modern scholarship has only slowly worked through the backlog of material. Popular accounts say protoform is undeciphered. What they usually mean is something more precise and less dramatic. We can read many of the signs and understand many of the documents in broad terms, but a significant fraction remains ambiguous, and subtle details of meaning are still under study. Even where we can read the tablets confidently, though there is another silence at work, one that has nothing to do with broken clay or sign lists. The people of Uruk did not invent writing to tell myths, record laws, or inscribe royal boasts. Those genres will come later, as the technology spreads and adapts. The earliest written world that we can see is dominated by numbers. It is an archive of quantities and categories, of entries and exits, a ledger of institutional metabolism. We can tell that there were different classes of workers because rations differ. We can infer the importance of certain festivals because resource allocations spike in particular months. We can see the outlines of herring and farming regimes in the way animals and fields are grouped on tablets. What we cannot hear almost at all voices of the people moving through that system. There are personal names, but usually just as entries in a list. So many loaves for so. There is no complaint from a worker about a short ration. No hymn from a brewer to the goddess of beer. No narrative explaining why this temple is bigger than that one, or why this city is at war with the town upriver. Things almost certainly existed in spoken form. They may even have been sung with great skill in the courtyards of the same buildings, whose backrooms held stacks of rationalists. But the writing system at this stage is not tuned to capture them. So Uruk before history had words is a bit of a misdirection. Uruk was full of words. Every market, every workshop, every canal bank echoed with spoken language and remembered stories. What it did not yet have was writing that could follow those words onto clay. Proto-Uniform Archive caught what the institutions most urgently needed to fix in place. Who owed what? Who received what? God's storehouse held which grain? When we look back across 5,000 years at that earliest archive, looking into a world that is meticulously recorded in numbers and signs for things, while motives, arguments, emotions, self-descriptions slide past untouched. It is not that the Europe scribes refused to record those inner worlds. The system they were inventing simply was not built to hold them yet. And by the time writing expanded enough to catch more of human experience, unrecorded centuries behind those first ledgers had already burned away into silence. When you line up those ledgers and read them tablet after tablet, the repetition starts to feel almost aggressive. Names, numbers, commodities, dates, columns of barley and beer, sheep and silver, heads and hands. It is like listening to a conversation, where one side keeps answering questions you did not ask, and never gets around to the ones you care about. That is where the idea of refusal comes in. Not refusal in the sense of a conscious conspiracy. Priests huddled together, deciding what must be hidden from the future. Refusal as an effective function of what the system was built to do, and what it was never asked to do. Handle. Key early writing in Uruk is overwhelmingly administrative, because the institutions that paid for scribes had administrative problems. A large temple employing hundreds of workers has an obvious incentive to track rations. A household with a few dependents does not. A central storehouse issuing grain to satellite sites needs records that can be checked and rechecked. Brewer's apprentice complaining that yesterday's batch soured does not. So the first texts we see are things that could not safely remain in memory. Obligations, deliveries, tallies, obligations again. They are not biographies, not prayers, not stories. Proto-cuneiform corpus from Uruk and its sister sites. There is almost nothing like a self-introduction. No, I so son of so did this. There are very few verbal forms at all. Almost no sign sequences that look like full sentences in later Sumerian. Instead, labeled quantities attached to row categories. That choice of genre has consequences. There are whole categories of human life that almost vanish in the early written record, not because they did not exist, because they were not billable. Personal feelings, for instance, for the tablets are full of hunger, but only as a number of loaves per day. They are full of fear, but only as counted guards and weapons assigned to a gate. No one writes, "Today the river flooded higher than anyone remembers, and I was afraid." No one writes, "My child died, and I brought an offering for him." Priest said these words. If those experiences are voiced at all, they are voiced in spoken laments, in private songs, in gestures we can no longer see. Dissent is similarly quiet. A worker might think the ration is unfair. Village might resent an increased levy of barley. A junior official might disagree with an allocation decision. None of that shows up on the tablets. What we see instead is the smooth surface of compliance. Ex-workers' Y-grain issued mechanism of distribution, not the negotiations, grumbling or resistance around it. Everyday speech disappears almost completely. Casual jokes, the gossip about who is sleeping with whom, the nicknames and slang that almost certainly colored Euro-Akkadian or early Sumerian just as they color every language now. Proto-cuneiform has signs for professions like shepherd, brewer, weaver, scribe. It has signs for basic commodities, for fields, for canals, for gods' names. It does not have a way yet to capture the kind of free-flowing phrasal conversation that would become possible later with full phonetic writing. Even in the realm of ideas, the selection is narrow. People imagine the world's first writing. They often picture origin myths, tales of gods making humans, kings receiving destinies from heaven. Those myths do exist in Mesopotamia, but they belong to a slightly later phase. Cuneiform has matured into a flexible system for recording language itself. In the earliest Uruk layers, explicit mythological narratives are almost wholly absent. We do see divine names in Anu, possibly others appearing as labels on temple property, or as headings for offerings. We see sequence terms that might correspond to festivals. Thus, but the stories that would later be told about those gods, the cosmologies and epics, do not appear in proto-cuneiform in anything like the form we know. This does not mean people in Uruk had no origin stories. On the contrary, the sheer complexity of their ritual calendar, inferred from later sources, suggests a dense mythic world. It simply means that in the first few centuries of writing, no one was yet paying scribes to put those stories into clay-proud myth, could still be handled by priests and singers. Barley could not. Here is where scribal incentives matter. Scribes in Uruk were not freelance authors. They were employees of large institutions, temples, perhaps palatial households. Training took time and resources. The signs they learned were the ones those institutions needed used. If you can write only a few hundred compound signs, and your day is measured in how many tablets you complete before the light fails, you use those signs to produce the documents your overseer demands. What did overseers demand? Records that could be audited, lists that could be checked against physical stores, names that could be matched to faces at the distribution point. Anything beyond that fell into one of two categories: socially risky or irrelevant. Risky texts would include any written record of internal conflict, criticism of a superior argument between priestly factions, dissent about how offerings were used. It would be naive to assume such tensions did not exist. Fixing them on clay would create a durable trace that could be used against people later in a world where literacy is rare, and tablets are controlled by powerful institutions. Writing a complaint is less like venting on a private notepad, and more like filing a formal accusation in triplicate. Most people will decide not to. Irrelevant in this context simply means not relevant to the paying institution's needs. Your love poem to a fellow scribe, private meditation on a dream, the amusing riddle someone told you in the courtyard. None of these yields a measurable administrative benefit. None improves the flow of grain or labor, so they do not justify costly clay and training time, at least not yet. This is where another layer of bias enters preservation. Even if a few early scribes did experiment with more expressive genres on clay, narrative, notes, teaching texts, little sketches of story, the survival chances of those tablets would be lower. They might be kept in less formal spaces, not in temple archives. They might be reused as fill-in walls, or simply crushed back into raw clay, once no longer needed. We also have to consider perishable media. Later, Mesopotamian sources refer to writing on waxed wooden boards, on leather, on perhaps even papyrus-like materials. These materials are cheap compared to fired clay, easier to erase, much less likely to survive millennia in the ground. It is entirely plausible, many specialists would say likely, that missing genres were already flourishing on such media while the clay tablets stayed focused on administration. School exercises, for instance, master scribe could sketch a simple narrative on a wax board, dictate a proverb, or compose a short hymn for students to copy and recite. Priests could keep ritual instructions on wooden tablets brought into the sanctuary only to when needed. Early rulers could have genealogies or boastful inscriptions on wooden doorposts or leather scrolls that have long since vanished. When we say proto-cuneiform refuses to speak about these things, we may really be hearing the preferences of clay, not of the culture. The result is a triple filter on what reaches us from Uruk. A genre filter, where institutions choose to pay for accounting instead of autobiography. Social filter, where risky speech avoids permanent form. And a material filter, where fragile media silently decay, while baked clay quietly endures time. As writing systems become more flexible, and literacy spreads beyond a tiny temple, bureaucracy, those filters shift. We start to see proverbs, legal codes, royal inscriptions, letters, myths, and eventually personal prayers, but the earliest strata remain heavily skewed. When we peer into the proto-cuneiform archive, we are not seeing an unbiased cross-section of Uruk life. We are seeing what one narrow slice of the city needed to remember in a durable way. That is why talk of secrecy or suppression misses the point. There is no need to imagine a council of elders banning love poetry from clay. More mundane forces are enough. Selection bias in what gets written, genre bias in what is considered worth formalizing, preservation bias in what survives a building collapse and the slow chemistry of the soil. Put together forces make proto-cuneiform feel like it is holding something back, and in a sense it is. Between every line of barley tallies, there are unrecorded arguments, affections, fears, jokes and myths. They were spoken, acted, remembered, and then lost. The archive shows us a city thinking about grain and labor. The rest of its inner life has to be inferred from shadows and from what happens next when the cities begin to write more than numbers, and another fire in another archive freezes, a different slice of human experience in place. Shift 1,000 years or so forward, and a few hundred kilometers to the northwest, and the clay starts to look very different. We leave the numerical shorthand of proto-cuneiform and walk into a palace where writing has grown up, no longer just notching quantities into clay, but bending a foreign script to fit a local language, wrapping numbers in words and words in sentences, where the archive does not just track grain, but people, lots of people. This is Ebla. Today it is Telmardik, a mound in western Syria about halfway between Hamer and Aleppo. In the mid-3rd millennium BCE, was the center of a kingdom that controlled trade routes between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levantine coast. Somewhere around 2400–2300 B.C.E., in a royal complex on the Acropolis, its bureaucrats created one of the largest cuneiform archives ever found from that early day period. When archaeologists opened those rooms in the 1970s, they did not find a neat library of shelves. They found a collapse, fallen walls, burned beams, broken furniture, and under it all, thousands of tablets and fragments slumped where they had fallen. When the wooden shelving gave way, in the first campaigns alone, around 1,700 more or less complete tablets were recovered, and several thousand more pieces. Subsequent seasons pushed the total into the range of 4,000, 5,000 inscribed objects from the palace area alone, depending on how you count joins and uninscribed lumps for the mid-late 3rd millennium B.C.E. That is a flood compared to Uruk's earlier account ledgers. The range of what Ebla chose to write down is broader, but the center of gravity is still administrative. The largest group of tablets are palace records, year-by-year accounts of deliveries to and from storerooms, allocations of wool and finished textiles, distributions of grain and oil, inventories of tools and animals. There are offering lists for gods and goddesses in Eb and neighboring towns, sequences of names followed by measures of flour, beer, animals, incense. There are diplomatic texts, copies of treaties, gift lists exchanged with rulers as far away as Kish, and perhaps marinaries for envoys. There are teaching texts and lexical lists used to train scribes in Sumerian and in the local tongue. And there are personnel lists, so many personnel lists. If you have been starved of names in Uruk, Ebla feels like opening a door into a crowded room. Suddenly the tablets recite them, not just kings and gods, but officials, merchants, weavers, singers, gatekeepers, royal children, foreign emissaries. They appear in lines that look at first glance monotonous. Name, patronymic, title or function, rations or wages. The volume is staggering. Some lists run to hundreds of individuals on a single tablet. Multiply that by hundreds of tablets, and you begin to understand why the discovery caused such a stir. Here, for the first time, was an early Near Eastern polity that seemed to be naming and categorizing thousands of its inhabitants to dust. In those lists, we see a court that manages enormous textile workshops, employing hundreds of women. We see teams of messengers moving between cities, ration allocations, calculated for particular routes. We see the king's household with its singers, cupbearers, barbers, physicians, chariot drivers. We even catch fleeting glimpses of foreign residents, interpreters, merchants from other cities, absorbed into the accounting system of Ebla's palace. The archive makes the city feel suddenly populated. It is not just ex-workers Y grain anymore. It is Ilikabku, son of Ibrahim, messenger, and Titabar, weaver of the house of the queen, Ishalim, barber, each attached to a daily ration of barley or oil. Hundreds of such lines marching steadily across the clay. And yet, as with Uruk, what we are allowed to hear is shaped by what the institutions needed. The names arrive, wrapped in function. No one pauses to tell us what Ili Kabu thought of his king, or whether Titabda sang as she worked. But compared to the faceless categories of proto-cuneiform, Ebla's documents at least let us imagine actual individuals attached to the system. To read those names at all, though, required an intellectual leap, not just by ancient scribes, but by modern scholars, because the language of most of these tablets is not straightforward Sumerian, and not yet the well-attested Akkadian of later periods. It is something in between and beside what specialists now call EAT. When the tablets first came to light, some researchers argued that EAT was essentially an N, early form of East Semitic, like Old Akkadian, written with Sumerian logs and syllables. Others proposed that it represented a separate North and Northwest Semitic language, closer to later Canaanite dialects, squeezed into a script designed for something else. Over the decades, careful analysis of grammar, vocabulary, onomastics, has nudged consensus towards seeing Elit as an early Semitic language with strong East Semitic features. but its own particular profile. The problem is that the writing system at Ebla is thoroughly mixed. Many signs are used logographically, Sumerian values that must be translated into the underlying Semitic word to spell out parts of words. Still others may function as determinatives, category markers that are not read aloud, bilingual or mixed texts. Sumerian lexical lists with elate glosses, for instance, help us tease apart some of these layers. But even there, uncertainty creeps in. A single sign might correspond to multiple Semitic roots. Given ending might be either a case marker or a frozen element in a name. As a result, readings of key passages can differ sharply between scholars. One tablet that looks like a straightforward list of offerings to certain deities might, under a different interpretation of a few signs, become evidence for a festival sequence or for the import of foreign cults. A phrase some translate as a technical textile term, others take as a personal name. Whole books have been written arguing over whether certain Ibar toponyms correspond to later biblical place names or whether supposed references to well-known cities are mirage-produced by over-eager readings. Even basic numbers are sometimes in dispute. Tablet might seem to record 600 units of wool allocated to a workshop. Another reading based on alternative values for the number signs, but lower that total. If you are trying to reconstruct the economic scale of the palace, these details matter. The script refuses to settle easily into modern categories. In this sense, Ebla is doubly lineal. It stands between the numeric picture writing of early Mesopotamia and the fully phonetic, sentence Anadian that would follow. And it stands for us between legibility and opacity. We can see much more of its world than we could at Uruk, but some of the most tantalizing phrases remain blurred. The language problem functions like a built-in censor. We know there is information there. Key to it is only partially recovered. What is clear, though, is that these tablets were not a dusty library for posterity. They were the beating heart of a living bureaucracy. The rooms where they were found, often labeled with archaeological codes like Palace G, Archive Room, LT.769, were laid out close to throne rooms and administrative spaces. Tablets were arranged by subject. Account tablets along one wall, lexical lists along another, diplomatic texts grouped together. Many show signs of heavy handling, smooth corners, finger marks, erasers, and corrections. Some were clearly temporary notes, kept only until an annual account was finalized. Others were rolled and sealed with cylinder seals, then stored as legal evidence of a treaty or transaction. You can imagine scribes moving through these rooms, pulling down tablets to verify an older transaction, adding new records at the end of a shelf, reading out names at ration distributions, while assistants matched them to faces in the Tule courtyard. The archive was not a museum. It was a tool, and then one day the tool stopped working, at some point in the late 3rd millennium, BCE. Many scholars place it around 2300 BCE, though the exact date and responsible conqueror are still discussed. The palace at Ebla was destroyed. Fire swept through the complex. Wooden shelves collapsed. Clay tablets that had been dried in the sun but not fully fired were suddenly baked rock hard by the heat, fixing them in place where they fell. The bureaucracy that produced them did not survive that moment. The king's scribes stopped making new lists. Personnel whose names crowd the tablets scattered, died, or were absorbed into other systems. But the archive, in its broken, burned state, remained. When the flames turned raw clay into ceramic, they froze a few decades of Ebla's administrative life for us to sift through 4,000 years later. What we have then is not Ebla's history in any complete sense. It is a palace court mid-sentence, a city at the height of its power in the act of naming and counting and allocating, interrupted by violence, then slowly buried. The sudden flood of names that makes Ebla feel so alive is also a sign of how abruptly that life ended. We hear the roll call of a kingdom's servants, never the last meeting where someone realized the shelves would not be needed again. If you walk back into those rooms in your mind and rewind the destruction, you can start to see why that ending feels so abrupt. Archaeologists talk about a destruction layer as if it were a neat line in the dirt. At Ebla, it is more like a thick band of chaos, charcoal and ash, melted mud brick. Roof beams collapsed and carbonized, the outlines of doorways and shelves ghosted by rows of fallen tablets. The heat was intense enough to warp some bricks and rogues who overfire others. Places you get pot-lidded shards, where the surface of a brick has blistered and spalled. Yet within that violence there is order, not because anyone arranged it, but because the physics of a burning building follow patterns. Heavy things drop first. Walls fall in predictable directions. Shelving gives way along the grain of the beams. The tablets did not just rain down randomly. They fell in arcs and fans that, when plotted carefully, trace the ghosts of where the shelves once stood. This is one of the strange gifts of ancient disaster. In a normal, long-lived archive, old tablets get reshuffled, discarded, reused. Shelves are reorganized. Documents are culled. The original order that archivists dream about dissolves over time. At Ebla, fire did that work in reverse. It fixed a particular moment of that order into the floor. Excavators in Palace G noticed early on that tablets of similar content tended to be found in tight clusters, tilted at similar angles, often leaning against one another like a collapsed row of books. In some rooms, tablets bearing Yarrand economic summaries lay in parallel rows, all tops pointing the same way, as if they had slid straight off a shelf above. In others, thin lexical lists and school tablets were stacked almost like a fallen pile of notebooks. By mapping these fall patterns in 3 dimensions, archaeologists can infer not just that shelves once lined the walls, but how high they were, how deep, even roughly how many levels there were. Dense wedge of tablets, sloping down from one wall toward the center of the room, suggests a tall unit that toppled outward. Scatter concentrated near the floor suggests a lower bench or platform. Combine that with what we know of later, Near Eastern libraries picture emerges, rows of wooden shelves along the walls, perhaps a central stand or table. Tablets sorted by type, and within type, sometimes by date or subject, not pristine, not static, but organized enough that when things fell, they fell in patterns. In some cases, you can almost walk the room again. Here, the big ledgers of grain accounts. There, the smaller administrative notes. A corner where lexical lists and school exercises pile up, suggesting a teaching area. Another corner with legal and diplomatic tablets, often thicker, bearing seal impressions. The fire did not care about the content of any of this. It consumed beams and plaster impartially, because many of the tablets had only been sun-dried, not kill-fired. The sudden blast of heat turned them from fragile raw clay into hard ceramic. What would have crumbled in a few centuries of damp soil instead became durable very process. That destroyed the palace made the archive into a time capsule. At the same time, the fire erased as much as it preserved. Some tablets show signs of thermal shock. Surfaces flaked off, edges exploded, inscriptions spoiled away. Others were crushed under falling masonry. Thousands of fragments recovered from the destruction layer represent texts that would once have been whole. There is a bias built into what we can read. Thicker tablets, or those protected by debris, survive better than thin, lightly incised ones. And then there is the question of what never made it into the destruction layer at all. We tend to talk about the ELA archive as if it were a single, coherent mass. In reality, the tablets come from several rooms in the palace complex, probably representing different offices and storage areas. It is entirely possible, some would say likely, that other rooms held other tablets that not yet been found, or that were destroyed so thoroughly that no readable pieces remain. C. There are hints in the surviving corpus that we are seeing only a slice of the palace's paperwork. For instance, you get references to documents that should exist, but do not turn up. Phrases like, as written on tablet X, or according to the sealed document of such treaty. Those X tablets may have been stored elsewhere, perhaps in a more secure inner room, perhaps carried away in the confusion before the final attack. The causes of that attack sit in the same space between evidence and speculation. Ebla's destruction is often placed in a context of wider upheaval in the late 3rd millennium B.C.E. Popular scenario links it to the expansion of Sargon of Akkad, or his grandson Naram Sin, whose own inscriptions boast of campaigns in the west and the subjugation of cities in the region. If those claims map onto Ebla's horizon, burning of Palace G might reflect an Akkadian assault, part of a larger reordering of power across Syria and Mesopotamia. Another line of interpretations sees the fall of Ebla as part of more local rivalries, perhaps conflict with nearby Mari or other Syrian polities, jockeying for control of trade routes. There are diplomatic texts from Ebla that mention kings of Mari, of Naga, of Kish. Alliances and enmities shift across the tablets. It would not be surprising if at some point those fragile arrangements collapse into open war. Environmental and economic explanations also hover at the edges. Some scholars wonder whether stresses in agricultural production, shifts in trade routes, or climatic fluctuations made the city more vulnerable, turning what could have been a recoverable fire into a terminal event. But the archaeological layer itself mainly tells us that something violent and hot happened, fast. Burned debris, collapsed architecture, no slow sequence of rebuilding above. So we end up with a range of plausible stories, a great empire from the east sweeping in, regional enemy finally gaining the upper hand, internal crisis that left the palace defenseless when fire broke out. Tablets do not settle the question. They name kings and envoys, record offerings and rations, but they do not pause to narrate their own end. What they do give us are the last routine entries. On one tablet, a list of barley allocations to textile workers runs down the surface, pleat and orderly, with no sign that the scribe knew anything unusual was happening outside. On another, an annual summary of wool disbursements closes with a standard line tying the account to a regal year formula. There is no last entry that breaks pattern, no hurried note about enemies at the gate or stores set aside for siege. From the perspective of the records, the system was functioning normally right up until it wasn't. This is typical of administrative archives caught in catastrophe. Bureaucracies are good at recording what is supposed to happen. They are less good at recording the moment when everything stops. People flee or fight or hide. Grabbing the year and wool ledger is not the priority, which means that even in a destruction layer as rich as Ebla's, there are silences we have to live with. We notice, for instance, how few narrative or literary texts appear compared to the volume of economic tablets. There are some hymns, some ritual texts, some school pieces that may preserve snippets of longer compositions. But if Ebla's scribes copied epics or myths or royal inscriptions on clay, most of those have not come down to us. Perhaps those genres were written on perishable materials, wooden boards, leather, papyrus that did not survive fire and soil. Perhaps they were stored in a different part of the palace, in a temple, or in private houses, none of which have yielded comparable caches. We also have almost nothing that looks like explicit political history from Ebla's own pen. Treaties are preserved, yes, but framed as legal formula. Year names may allude to major events. The year such and such city was defeated, for instance. But the short phrases are embedded in account headings, not elaborated into chronicles. If there were annals, royal stela, or more expansive narratives, they are either still under the mound or gone. And then there is the possibility of deliberate removal, be a feat. If there was any warning, officials might have evacuated the most important diplomatic texts or legal documents, carrying sealed tablets to a new center of power, or simply away from danger. Those tablets would never reach the destruction layer, so they vanish from our view. Fire, in other words, acts as both archivist and censor. It freezes some things exactly where they stood, turns others to dust, and selects blindly what the future will be allowed to see. At Ebla blaze that brought down, Palace G turned a working archive into a buried snapshot. From the angle of a beam and the tilt of a stack of tablets, we can reconstruct shelving from repetitive lines of barley and wool. We can reconstruct a bureaucracy from gaps where genres ought to be. We can sense other rooms, other media, other stories that escaped the flames or were never offered to clay at all post. We are left holding the remains of a palace in mid-calculation, trying to read in its burned shelves not just what was recorded, what the fire quietly refused to carry forward. If Ebla gives us a palace surprised by fire in the middle of its paperwork, Nineveh gives us almost the opposite, a king who tried very consciously to put the world in order before anything burned. By the 7th century B.C.E., Nineveh was not just a city, it was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, state that stretched at its height, from the Taintons of western Iran to the Mediterranean, from Egypt's borders up into Anatolia. Ashurbanipal, who ruled from roughly 669 to around 631 B.C.E., sat at the top of that structure. His is one of the few ancient Near Eastern kings we can hear in his own words, because he tells us, again and again, what he thought he was doing in his inscriptions. Ashurbanipal boasts of military campaigns and hunting lions, as kings were supposed to. He also adds something different long passages about his literacy. He tells us he learned the craft of the scribe, could read difficult, Sumerian and Akkadian, studied inscriptions from before the flood. Whether or not we take all of that at face value, his reign produces one unmistakable fact: an accumulation of tablets on a scale that dwarfs anything earlier. When excavators working at Nineveh in the 19th century, in the Nun, cleared the rooms of his North Palace and the nearby Southwest Palace, began to hit drifts of clay. Layer after layer of broken tablets and fragments, mixed with ash and rubble, filling doorways and corners. Time as the pieces were washed, sorted and catalogued, the numbers climbed. The Library of Ashurbanipal, in the broad sense of all tablets associated with his collecting, efforts now runs into the tens of thousands, around 30,000 to 35,000 tablets, and larger fragments with far more tiny pieces that may or may not eventually join them. Even if we allow for overlap, for multiple copies of the same text, for school exercises and file copies, that is still an enormous volume of writing for the ancient world. It is not an accidental accumulation of office trash, the patterns in siphons, the little notes scribes sometimes add at the end. Make that clear. Many of those notes spell out where a tablet's contents came from. A scribe will write that a composition was according to its original, copied from an old tablet or taken from the mouth of a particular master. Some mention specific cities and temples, texts brought from Babylon, from Bortipa, from Nippur. Others say outright that a piece is one tablet from a series kept in the temple of such a god. Put together, they show us how Ashurbanipal's project worked. Official envoys, governors, temple administrators were instructed to supply texts from their local archives. Tablets were borrowed or seized from shrines in southern Mesopotamia, from cities with much older written traditions than Assyria's. In some cases, whole series were copied in situ, with Ashurbanipal scribes preparing new versions for Nineveh while leaving the originals in place. In other cases, the originals themselves seem to have been carried back north. At home, trained scribes in Nineveh's palace and temple schools took those models and multiplied them. They produced clean new copies, sometimes correcting or restoring damaged lines. They collated variant versions. They standardized within limits the way older works were written and organized. The result is not just a stash of tablets, but a curated library. Inside that collection, we are not looking at the daily stream of administration in the way we were at Ebla. There are certainly administrative and legal tablets in Nineveh, letters, decrees, accounts. But they are only one part of the whole. What stands out is the breadth of genres. Ashurbanipal wanted under his roof. There are omen series in staggering quantity, tablets that map the appearance of the liver in a sacrificed sheep onto the fate of king and country. Tablets that interpret the way oil swirls on water, the shape of smoke, the behavior of newborn animals, astronomical and astrological series that correlate planetary positions and eclipses with political outcomes. One canonical celestial omen series, Enuma, Anu, Enlil, originally ran to dozens of tablets. Multiple copies of its parts show up in Nineveh. There are rituals, incantations to drive out demons, litans to soothe angry gods, elaborate step-by-step descriptions of how to purify a house, a person, a statue. The compendia of healing magic and practical medicine blur into one another. Here, some tablets list symptoms and corresponding treatments, bandages, salves, plant preparations, alongside spoken formula. Others are almost purely ritual, but the underlying assumption is the same. Something goes wrong in the body or the city. There is a pattern for that, and a text that tells you how to respond. There are lexical lists, descendants of the school tablets we glimpse already in early Mesopotamia, but now expanded, systematized, and arranged. Sumerian words with their Adian equivalents, categorized by topic, stones, woods, animals, professions, gods. For scribes, these were reference tools and training manuals. For Ashurbanipal's collectors, they were also suppositories of tradition, a way to hold on to older languages and classifications that reached back more than a millennium. There are epics and hymns. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the most famous now, and Nineveh's copies, especially the so-called Standard Babylonian version, have shaped how modern readers know that story. But Gilgamesh is only one thread. Other compositions recount the creation of the world, the deeds of gods like Marduk and Ishtar, the ordering of kingship. Hymn collections praise deities in formal language that was already archaic in Ashurbanipal day. There are scholarly commentaries, tablets that quote lines from earlier works and then gloss them word by word, explaining rare terms, proposing alternate readings, linking a difficult phrase in a hymn to an omen rule or a ritual instruction. These are the margins of the ancient world, but written out as separate texts and layered around all of this. There is the business of empire, letters from provincial governors about rebellions, taxes, and troop movements, reports from divers on ominous eclipses, decrees, and legal decisions. Not all of those were intended as part of a library, in the same sense as the curated literary and scholarly series, but in practice they ended up in the same palace complex, in overlapping rooms and storerooms. From the outside, it can look like Ashurbanipal simply wanted more of everything. His inscriptions say as much. He claims to have collected the writings of all lands, to have made his palace a place where the wisdom of the past was stored. In reality, what we see is less an indiscriminate hoard and more a specific definition of what counted as wisdom. The library is heavy on texts that promise to reveal hidden structures, omens that decode the future, rituals that repair the presents that map the world of words and things, natives that explain why the gods arranged power as they did. It preserves technical literature, religious and scientific, in the terms of its own time, and it wraps that literature in layers of commentary and tradition, choice in that process. What to copy from a temple in Babylon and what to ignore, which variant of a myth to canonize, which kinds of everyday documents to leave in the offices where they were used, builds an archive with an agenda. Ashurbanipal's library is not the total paperwork of his empire, it is the subset of writing he judged necessary for ruling, divining, legitimizing. When Nineveh finally burned, much of that curated wisdom was baked into permanence, along with everything else. The selection that fire acted upon had already been filtered once by royal command and scribal preference. What looks to us like the great surviving library of ancient Mesopotamia is in that sense already a statement about what one king thought ought to survive. In 612 BCE, the city that had tried to pull the written world into its orbit was itself pulled apart. The coalition that came for Nineveh, the Babylonians, the Mes and their allies, did not arrive as librarians. They besieged the city, broke its defenses, and sacked it. Later chronicles speak of great slaughter, of palaces and temples plundered, of the city turned into ruins and mounds. Archaeology backs up at least the outline of that picture. In Ashurbanipal's North Palace and the Southwest Palace, the same rooms that once stored carefully arranged tablets show layers of charred beams, collapsed mud, brick, and ash. For the clay archives, this was both an ending and a transformation. Under normal circumstances, a cuneiform tablet is fragile. It is formed from wet clay, inscribed, and then either left to dry in the sun or only lightly fired. Dropped on a hard surface, it can shatter. Left in damp soil, it can dissolve. But in a burning palace, something else happens. Roof timbers and ceilings come down, trapping shelves and tablet bins beneath them. Fires burn hot and long in enclosed spaces. The clay heats through, not just on the surface, but all the way to its core. What had been soft or only partially hardened becomes ceramic. Nineveh's fall turned parts of Ashurbanipal's library into a kiln. That is why we can still read thousands of tablets from a city that ceased to function more than 2,600 years ago. The destruction that killed its inhabitants also gave its texts a kind of immortality. Roofs did not collapse in neat protective layers. Shelves splintered, jars and baskets overturned, tablets tumbled, cracked, and exploded along their internal weaknesses. Flames died out, and the rubble cooled. The order that scribes had built over decades was buried under a chaos of broken clay. By the time 19th-century excavators cut into those ruins, what they were uncovering was not a library in place with labeled shill shelves and tidy stacks, drifts of fragments. In some rooms the tablets lay relatively close to where they had fallen, compressed into thick deposits. In others, later disturbances or ancient looting had churned them, weathering. Even the pressure of centuries of overburden had ground corners away and turned sharp edges into crumbs. The result is that many of the tablets we talk about from Nineveh are not complete, self-contained objects. They are pieces sometimes large enough to carry multiple columns of text, sometimes no bigger than a fingernail with only a few signs. Now add one more complication: mixing. When shelves collapsed, they did not respect the categories the scribes had worked with. Tablets from an omen room could end up scattered into an adjacent corridor. Legal documents could slip down, cracked through cracked floors, into rooms that had once held rituals. When rubble was later disturbed, either in antiquity or during early digging, this mixing intensified in modern museums. Tablets from different rooms, and even different excavation campaigns were sometimes stored together, only later separated by content and script type. What this means is that our picture of Ashurbanipal's library is stitched together from fragments that have been shuffled at least twice, once by ancient destruction and once by modern recovery. This matters especially when we talk about series. Many of the most important scholarly works in Nineveh's collection were not single tablets but extended compositions spread across multiple pieces. The great omen compendia were organized into numbered sequences. A liver omen series might run to dozens of tablets, each one covering a particular set of signs. The celestial omen series, Enuma, a new NL, for instance, thought to have included around 70 tablets in its full form. Lexical lists, too, were structured in Series Tablet 1, beginning with a particular sequence of entries Tablet 2, continuing where it left off, and so on. To be complete series had to be whole. Missing even one tablet could mean losing a cluster of rules or a section of vocabulary. Scribes in Ashurbanipal time knew this, and often noted in their colophons the place of a tablet within its series. Tablet 3 of 16, Tablet 7 of the series beginning. These labels are some of our best guides today for reconstructing what once sat on the shelves. Fire and collapse did not preserve series. They preserved whatever pieces happened to be in the right place when the palace came down. For many compositions, we have tablet numbers that skip. We may have Tablet 1, Tablet 4, and Tablet 9 of a series, but nothing in between. In other cases, we have tablets whose coffins refer to a larger series that we barely know, hinting at lost components now represented only by a stray quotation in a commentary or a single, reused fragment in another context. And even where multiple tablets from a series survive, they are often divided. The first major excavations at Nineveh, conducted under Austin Henry Leard and his successors, Insexes, in the mid-19th century shipped crates of tablets to London. Pieces became the core of what is now the British Museum's cuneiform collection. Later digs at the site run by different teams sent their finds elsewhere, to the Louvre in Paris, to museums in Istanbul, Berlin, Baghdad, Mosul, and beyond. Some tablets entered private collections. Others were recorded in field notes that are now lost or incomplete. Modern cataloging and digital projects are slowly bringing virtual order to this dispersal. Scholars compare photographs and drawings, noticing that a fragment in London physically joins a piece in Berlin or that two copies of the same series tablet, separated by a century of collecting history, preserve complementary halves of a line, 30,000 to 35,000 library tablets, and larger fragments from Nineveh, and many more tiny pieces. This work is painstaking and ongoing, but the basic situation remains. The library that was once concentrated in a few palace complexes is now scattered across continents. This dispersal complicates more than simple reconstruction of broken texts. It makes it harder to know what the original catalogue looked like, or even whether there was a single unified catalogue in our sense. We can infer categories from fine spots and from recurring cauliflas, tablet of incantations, of the house of such and such, tablet of the exorcist's house, tablet of kingship rituals. But those inferences rest on a sample that has been thinned and jumbled. We can see that certain series were present. We can count copies of particular works. We can trace which older cities Ashurbanipal scribes drew on. What we cannot do with confidence is say that we have the entire pattern of what he collected. And there is another, quieter bias built into what survived. Clay administrative documents existed in enormous quantities in Neo-Assyrian cities, but many were short and never baked. They were meant to be useful for a few years, then discarded, recycled, or left to disintegrate. Tablets that were durable enough to make it through Nineveh's destruction and attractive enough to early collectors tend to be the larger, more formal pieces, the omen series, the elaborate rituals, the lexical lists, the official letters with royal seals. In that sense, fire did not just bake tablets, it selected them. The irony is hard to miss. Ashurbanipal library is famous because Nineveh was destroyed without the burning and collapse of 612 BCE. Much of his curated collection might have been reused, eroded, or simply lost to the slow breakage of everyday handling. The catastrophe that ended the preserved a slice of its intellectual life with a clarity we do not have for calmer periods. Yet what we see is still only a shadow. The series we know may be those that happened by chance to leave enough copies in the right rooms. Other series may have lost too many links in the chain for us to recognize them. Catalogue that Ashurbanipal's scribes held in their heads, or perhaps on now vanished perishable materials, is only partly mirrored in the bake play. Our disposal and the library, that seems from our modern vantage point to hold the writings of all lands, was itself already a narrowed selection, further narrowed by destruction and dispersal. We stand effectively in the ruins of a ruin, reading across breaks, joining fragments from distant shelves and distant countries, trying to infer from what survived in fire what a royal library once contained, and what it quietly let go. When we talk about Ashurbanipal's library, it is tempting to imagine a place that wanted everything. The king boasts in his inscriptions that he collected the tablets of the land of Sumer and Akkad, that he sought writings from before the flood, that he understood even the obscure scripts of remote temples, standing in front of shelves lined with baked clay. It feels like we are looking at the total memory of an empire. But even in the rooms best stocked with tablets, there is a quieter truth. Royal libraries preserve elite knowledge. They almost never preserve a whole society. The tablets at Nineveh, at Ebla, at Hattusa, were written by specialists, for other specialists, for the palace that employed them. They are overwhelmingly the records that literate elites thought were worth fixing in clay. Accounts, treaties, omen series, ritual instructions, lexical lists, royal letters, royal annals. That is not accidental. Writing was time-consuming. Training was expensive. Clay and shelf space were not infinite. Every tablet represents a decision, conscious or not, about what deserved to be turned from breath into baked earth. Most of life never made that leap. In a Neo-Assyrian city of tens of thousands of people, perhaps a few hundred were fully trained scribes. Yet the city functioned because thousands of others farmed, wove, brewed, argued, sang, prayed, cursed, negotiated, fell in love, raised children without ever touching a stylus. Their stories ran in spoken channels, jokes told in taverns, lullabies hummed in dark rooms, gossip traded in market stalls, local proverbs repeated until no one remembered who said them first. None of that shows up in a royal library unless it accidentally intersects with palace interests. We see this gap even where our documentation is richest. Ashurbanipal collection preserves multiple copies of complex omen that run to dozens of tablets. For some topics like heptoscopy, divination by a sacrificial animal's liver, we have thousands of lines detailing every possible blemish and its predicted meaning. For the daily routines of the people who cut those animals, or the songs they sang while working, we have almost nothing. The same goes for Ebla, around 2350 B.C.E. Some 15,000 tablets, mostly administrative and diplomatic. Tell us more about the movement of wool tin than about how ordinary ablates told stories at night. So when we ask what a royal library did not preserve, some absences are simple. It did not preserve most of everyday life. Others are more pointed. Royal archives rarely give us dissent in its own voice. When political opposition surfaces in our texts, it is usually because it has already been defeated. Letters complain about disloyal officials. Animals describe rebels who were crushed. Oracular queries ask whether some named magnate is plotting treason. What we do not have is the rebel's manifesto on clay counter-narrative of a provincial governor who thought the king's policies was disastrous. Those views likely existed. They may even have been put in writing in some cases, in letters that never made it into palace archives, or were deliberately destroyed when their authors fell from favor. The same narrowing applies to social rank and gender in the thousands of legal and administrative tablets from early city-states. The names that recur belong to merchants, temple officials, palace agents, high-status women managing estates. The poor appear mostly as numbers, labor quotas fulfilled, rations issued. Their emotions, criticisms of the powerful, their local sayings had to travel by word of mouth. In the palace collections that fire baked for us, their voices arrive, if at all, as the object of someone else's record. There is also a linguistic narrowing. At Nineveh, at Hattusa, Mari, and elsewhere, the written languages of the archive were often conservative, formal registers, Standard Babylonian for literature and scholarship, Middle Assyrian or Neo-Assyrian for administration, Hittite and Akkadian in Hattusa's chancery. But those were not the only tongues people actually spoke. Local dialects, minority languages, everyday slang, mostly remained oral. When vernacular speech appears at all, it does so in rare glosses, stray lines of dialogue in letters, or scribal jokes in school exercises. It is plausible, though not provable, that whole genres flourished off the tablets. Regional folktales, improvised theatre, satirical songs, needling, officials, erotic verse, lullabies, and work songs, with histories stretching back centuries. Bits of these may be faintly reflected in later recorded myths, or in proverbs that do appear in collections, but the living performances that carried them are beyond reach. If such performances were politically sharp, poking at kings and governors, there would have been even less incentive to record them in a royal repository. This does not necessarily mean there was a secret censorship office in the palace methodically, purging the archives. The mechanisms could be much simpler. Any bureaucracy that reports upward tends to filter provincial governor writing to Nineveh, leaves out details that might annoy the king or that he thinks are irrelevant to royal concerns. Scribe compiling omens chooses formulations that match accepted doctrine. Temple administrator records the rations that matter for audits and ignores the informal, favors the oil social relations. This is ordinary self-censorship, people tailoring what they write because they know who might read it. Some censorship may have been more direct. We have later Mesopotamian colophons warning that unauthorized persons must not see a tablet, or that a text is for the learned, not for the commoner. Esoteric ritual instructions were probably not meant to circulate freely. Tablets could be recopied with adjustments, emitting awkward illusions, harmonizing politically sensitive stories with current royal ideology. But the evidence fragmentary picture of these processes is incomplete. What we can safely say is that the combination of elite interests, practical constraints, ordinary caution shaped what went onto the shelves in the first place. Even among the tablets that did get written, Many remain, in a sense, silent. Some are physically unreadable. Fire that baked a tablet hard enough to survive could also warp it, fuse its surfaces, cause chunks to sprawl off. Lines vanish into cracks. Salt and moisture eat away at edges in the centuries after excavation. Other tablets are written in rare scripts or obscure local hands. Elate syllabic conventions. Unusual Hittite ductus shorthand used in specialist schools that only a handful of experts can confidently pass. Portion of Nineveh's fragments seem to belong to genres we recognize: omen commentaries, incantations, lexical texts, but use technical vocabulary so dense that we can translate the individual signs without being sure of the overall meaning. Then there is the problem of joins. Many tablets exist only as widely scattered pieces. A corner in London carries a line number and half a phrase. Sliver in Mosul preserves the rest of that line and a colophon until someone notices the match. Sometimes decades after both pieces were first catalogued, we may not even know that a lost series existed. With tens of thousands of fragments still awaiting detailed study and high-resolution imaging, it is likely that parts of Ashurbanipal's collection and of Ebla's and Hattusa's are effectively unread because their components have not yet been reassembled. Given all this, cautious speculation has a place, but it has to stay marked as speculation. When we imagine the missing genres, we are extrapolating from what little we do see. A proverb tablet here, stray hymn there. A school exercise that copies a line of obviously humorous verse, plausible that for every formal epic preserved in multiple copies. There were many shorter tales told only in spoken form, perhaps occasionally scribbled in ephemeral media, like waxed wooden boards that did not survive fire and mud. Plausible that politically sensitive narratives, critical songs, alternative origin myths for rival dynasties, local stories that downplayed the king's centrality, were lively in oral tradition, but kept official clay. Yet plausibility is not proof. The archive's silences resist easy filling in. What a royal library did not preserve is therefore double. There is what it never tried to record, and what it once held, but we can no longer reconstruct. Between the two lies the space where most human experience took place, spoken, sung, gestured, remembered without ever passing through a stylus. To understand ancient archives, we have to read not only the baked lines that survived the fires, but also the gaps between them, and the choices that put some words on clay while leaving others to vanish with the voices that spoke them. If Nineveh shows us what a later Syrian king wanted on his shelves, Hattusa lets us walk through something stranger written memory of a kingdom where almost nobody spoke the main archive, language as their mother tongue. High in the hills of central Anatolia, at modern Bogazko in Turkey, the Hittites built their capital. By the 14th and 13th centuries B.C.E., Late Bronze Age, roughly the time of Akhenaten and Ramesses in Egypt, Hattusa was a fortified city of gates and temples and storage magazines place, where roads from Syria, the Gagean, and the Black Sea all met. Under its ruined palaces and sanctuaries, archaeologists have found what is effectively the central archive of a whole empire. The numbers alone are daunting. Excavations since 1906 have recovered on the order of 25,000 tablets and many more fragments, from Hattusa, most of them from temple and palace contexts on the Acropolis in the lower city. Some rooms seem to have been dedicated tablet repositories, their shelves collapsed and baked by the same destruction that brought the empire down around 1200 B.C.E. Others were mixed storerooms, where administrative notes lay beside ritual texts or letters, gone out of date. If you stack the publication volumes on a table, they form a small wall, and yet beneath the scale, first impression is not abundance but complexity. Unlike at Ebla or early Uruk, Hattusa's clay is multilingual by design. The script is cuneiform, adapted ultimately from Mesopotamia, but the languages written with it form a small universe. The bulk of the archive is in what we call Hittite. Speakers called it the language of Hatti. It belongs to the Indo-European family, distantly related to later tongues like Greek and Latin. but it sits at a very early conservative branch. Mixed in with Hittite are texts in Luwian and Pelik, two other Anatolian Indo-European languages probably spoken in different regions of the kingdom. There are hundreds of tablets in Hurrian, non-Indo-European language associated with Syria and the kingdom of Mitanni, reflecting deep cultural entanglement with the south and southeast. Cutting across all of this is Atanian, the international diplomatic and scholarly language of the late Bronze Age, from which Hittite scribes Pot originally borrowed their writing system. On a single shelf in a Hattusa storeroom, you might have found an Atanian treaty with Egypt, Hittite legal code, a Hurrian, Hittite bilingual hymn, and a ritual in Luwian, written with Hittite explanatory glosses. This linguistic layering shapes everything we can say about what Hattusa archive was and what it left out. Frost, when we ask, what is actually written on these thousands of tablets? The answer looks familiar at first glance. Hittite kings, like their Mesopotamian and Egyptian peers, loved treaties. The most famous, with Ramesses II, after the Battle of Kadesh, survives in both Akkadian and Egyptian versions. Hattusa has others: agreements with vassal rulers in Syria and Anatolia, oaths sworn by local kings, boundary settlements, codifying who controls which fortresses or pastures. Many are recorded in Adian, the shared diplomatic language, often with Hittite translations or summaries attached for internal use. There are laws, long Hittite law collection, that sets fines and compensations for injuries, theft, adultery, property disputes. It looks at a distance, like the law codes of old Babylonian Mesopotamia, but with its own assumptions about property, slavery, and sexual conduct. Court documents show actual cases being argued, verdicts sent out from the palace. There are rituals and festival texts in staggering variety, yearly state festivals, the Perui, the Kilam, the spring and autumn celebrations that bound together gods from across the realm, required detailed scripts: who carries which offering, which hymn is sung, which myth is recited on which day. Many of these ritual tablets are in Hittite, but some incorporate Luwian or Huron refrains, preserving spits of liturgical language that may already have sounded archaic or exotic to the scribes who copied them. Mythological narratives weave through the corpus, stories of the storm god Tahuna, the grain god Telpinu, who disappears and must be brought back, to restore fertility of divine struggles and reconciliations. Some are in Hittite, some translated or adapted from Huron originals. They sit side by side with omen texts, incantations against illness or sorcery, and instructions for royal purifications, many of them declared in coffins to be secret of the great king. Then there is the correspondence: hundreds of letters, royal orders to governors, reports from frontier officials, complaints from vassal kings who feel slighted, requests for grain shipments during famine, diplomatic exchanges with Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt. Most of the international letters are in Akkadian, following the long-standing practice of Near Eastern chancelleries. Occasionally scribes slip between languages in the same document, using Hittite for formula and Akkadian for names or technical terms. Paper. If there had been paper, the Hittite archive would look like a model of inclusion: multiple languages, multiple genres, capital city, consciously collecting and standardizing the written practices of its realm. But multilingual writing, like any system, selects every time a text crosses a language boundary. When a Huron hymn is translated into Hittite, for example, someone decides what is worth carrying over, what can be dropped. Parallel versions of the same myth sometimes differ in subtle ways. A god's epithet altered, a line compressed, a local detail smoothed away. It is not always possible to tell whether this is simple scribal error, adaptation for a different audience, quiet theological editing. What we can see is that translation is not neutral. It is another kind of filter. Some genres move more easily across these boundaries than others. Treaties and royal letters are the most likely to be bilingual, or to exist in both Akkadian and Hittite versions. Elite ritual texts, connected to state festivals, are often translated and recopied because they matter to the central cult. But local cult practices, neighborhood rituals in provincial towns, private charms muttered in kitchens and sheepfolds. If they were ever written, they probably remained in local archives or ephemeral formats, and rarely entered the central collections at Hattusa. If a Luwian village ritual appeared on clay at all, it might stay in Luwian in the hands of Louisian-speaking priests, never translated into Hittite for a palace reader. Aedean itself at Hattusa was a specialist skill. Scribes trained in the full Mesopotamian tradition could read and compose in it. They maintained lexical lists and model letters to keep that knowledge alive. The more technically demanding Aedean scholarship, esoteric divination series, advanced lexical commentaries, seems to have circulated in limited circles. Some tablets explicitly state that a text is for the learned, not for the commoner. Even within the writing class, there were inner rooms. From our vantage point, this produces layered opacities. Texts that stayed in minority languages like Palaic or some Huron dialects are hard to interpret now, because those languages are poorly attested, side USA. We may recognize the genre, a ritual, a hymn, but not understand much of its content. Bilingual tablets help, but they are uneven. Sometimes translate only selected passages. Where a Hittite summary replaces a full Huron original, we are left with an abstract of something we can no longer fully hear. Conversely, when Hittite scribes translated foreign myths or rituals into their own language, they sometimes domesticated them, placing unfamiliar gods with local equivalents or reshaping stories to fit Hittite royal ideology. The original nuance is gone, fossilized only where a stray line of the source tongue was left in the margin. In other words, Hattusa's archive shows us an empire trying to knit many tongues into a single, written system, and in doing so, deciding whose words would be legible at the center, and whose would remain specialists' property or vanish into the air after the last speaker died. Behind every tablet in that hilltop city, there was a choice. This treaty, not that village oath, this liturgy, not that lulai, this version of a Huron myth, not the others that stayed in people's memories. Fire that eventually baked Hattusa's shelves, preserved a multilingual empire on clay, but it also locked in its preferences and blind spots, leaving us with strata of speech where some layers are sharply inscribed and others are only shadows under the text. Ritual language sits right at the edge of what we can know from these archives. It is also where the gaps are widest. Take those Hittite festival tablets from Hattusa. On the surface they look generous. A single tablet might lay out the full sequence of a fourth-day rite. Which divinity is invoked at dawn? What offering is placed on which altar myth is recited at sunset? Some are long enough that modern editions run to dozens of pages, but when you look closely at the language begins to slip away. Ritual and magical texts everywhere tend to behave like this. They hoard rare words, terms that never show up in everyday letters or laws. They preserve fossilized phrases from older stages of a language from neighboring tongues, treated as sacred formulas, whose power lies partly in sounding strange. They code-switch Hittite instruction, framed around a Huron refrain with a Louisian divine name, dropped in the middle, or an Akkadian incantation that suddenly switches to Sumerian for the climactic line to the priests who used them. That was the point. The foreignness, the archaism, the obscurity were features, not bugs. Sacred words were not supposed to be transparent. Their effectiveness came from tradition, from correct recitation, not from everyday intelligibility. For modern readers creates something like static. We can often see the outline of what is happening. This section is clearly a diagnosis of impurity. That section lists offerings. This refrain looks like an exorcistic formula, but the individual words may be one-offs with no parallels or loan words from a ritual jargon we barely know. The problem compounds when the clay itself is damaged. Even in the best preserved archives, many tablets are broken. The upper left corner where a ritual's title and purpose might be written is gone. The bottom edge sif might have named the scribe, or the place is missing. Sometimes, a sign breaks right through the middle, leaving us with only a few wedge strokes to guess from. In administrative texts, context bails us out. If you see 10 sheep, 5 goats, and a half-broken sign after a date, you can often reconstruct a plausible reading. In ritual texts, missing sign might be part of a divine epithet, attested nowhere else, or the key, a verb that tells us whether the rite is purifying, healing, or aggressive magic aimed at an enemy. This is what archaeologists mean when they call a passage untranslatable. It is not that the entire language is unknown, it is that in that line, too many variables stack up. A broken sign, a rare word form, code switching between languages, and a genre that delights in compressed formulaic phrasing, layer on top of that the scribes' own habits of shorthand. In liturgical contexts, scribes sometimes wrote only the first few signs of a well-known formula, trusting that any trained ritualist would know to fill in the rest from memory. They used logs, Sumerian signs read out in Hittite or Akkadian, as compact labels for whole phrases. They abbreviated divine names or ritual actions that were too familiar to need spelling out. A kophif might say, from the mouth of the old tablets, telling us that this is a copy of an earlier exemplar, whose language may already have been archaic. Hittite scribes occasionally annotate a Huran or a Adian word as not to be changed, signaling that even they were treating it as a fixed charm, not ordinary speech. So when a modern editor produces a translation, there is often a long scaffold of reconstruction behind each smooth line. Scholars start by lining up parallels. If a given festival is described on 10 tablets from different rooms and reigns, they collect them looking for repeated sequences. A broken line in one copy may be intact in another ritual rubric that survives only in Huran on one tablet might be summarized in a Hittite elsewhere. Bilingual and even trilingual lists are another lifeline. Hattusa, like Nineveh, preserved lexical tablets that line up Sumerian signs, Akkadian equivalents, and sometimes Hittite glosses. A rare log in a ritual may appear in a lexical list with more explanation. Eblers, bilingual, Sumerians' blate vocabularies serve a similar function for that earlier archive. Then there is the painstaking work of joining fragments for Nineveh and Hattusa. Thousands of broken pieces sit in museums and depots. 2 fragments are found to fit literally, physically. What was once nonsense syllables can snap into place as a familiar phrase, at least a repeatable pattern. Digital imaging and 3D scanning have accelerated this, allowing virtual joins that would be risky with the clay itself. Context does a lot of the remaining work. Damaged line appears right after a list of animals and before a sequence of libation instructions. We may cautiously infer that it names a sacrifice. If a peculiar Huran phrase recurs only in tablets associated with the Key Lamb festival, we can tentatively label it as part of that rite's core liturgy. Even if the literal meaning stays opaque, every step involves probabilities rather than certainties. Additions flag doubtful readings with brackets and question marks. Alternative reconstructions sit in footnotes. What makes it into the smooth, popular summary? The line about the priest lifts his hands and speaks thus is often the most confident layer over an underlying text that is much more hesitant, and some things simply do not come across at all. Clay is excellent at preserving sequences of signs. It is nearly useless for capturing performance. We know from occasional stage directions that rituals involve music. There are mentions of lyres, drums, professional singers. Some tablets note that a passage is to be sung, not spoken. Others specify that a certain line must be whispered, or that the priest turns, washes, touches the hearth, draws a circle, stands at the right side of the king. But these notes are sparse. Tablet records the melody of a Huran hymn in a way we can reliably reconstruct. No cuneiform sign tells us the exact vocal quality, the tempo, the emotional tone of an incantation muttered over a sick child. Gestures are mentioned when they matter legally or ridley. Most of the time, they were probably too obvious to the practitioners to need writing down. Intonation, rhythm, the shared understanding of when a word was spoken straight and when it was charged with irony or fear. All of that lived in air and memory, not on clay. So even where we can translate a ritual line for line, we may be reading something closer to a bare lirito than to the performance itself. The tablets tell us that a myth was recited, They almost never tell us what the storyteller's voice did on the crucial syllables, or how the gathered crowd responded. In that sense, fire and time consume meaning in two different ways. Burning of Ea or Hattusa baked the tablets and fixed their signs in place. It kept moisture, mold, reuse from grinding them back into anonymous clay. But the longer arc, the loss of spoken traditions, the fading of ritual schools, death of the last priest who knew how to sing a hurry and refrain over a Hittite sacrifice, burned away layers that had never been written down, or that were only ever hinted at in compressed shorthand. We hold the physical record of these words in our hands. We can count the tablets, tens of thousands from Hattusa, tens of thousands more from Nineveh, thousands from Ebla, hundreds of fragmentary proto-form tablets from Uruk. We can map them, classify them, edit them, and yet in the spaces where a rare sign is chipped off, where a line shifts without explanation into an extinct liturgical tongue, where a melody should rise but the clay is silent, different kind of loss shows through. The archive survived the flames, but whole dimensions of meaning, sound, gesture, shared assumptions, did not. Even when the signs are perfectly legible, parts of the message are gone. The tablets endure, but some of what they carried has already burned away. If ritual language hides things behind strangeness, diplomatic language does almost the opposite. It hides things behind familiarity. By the late Bronze Age, something like an international system had taken shape across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. From Hattusa to Thebes, from Babylon to the cities of Syria and Canaan, kings wrote to one another on clay. Treaties were inscribed, vassal oaths were copied and recopied, interdynastic marriages, requests for gold, complaints about messengers, whole lifetimes of statecraft ended up pressed into tablets. On the surface looks like unprecedented transparency. For the mid-2nd millennium BCE, we have the correspondence from places like Amarna in Egypt, Hattusa in central Anatolia, and the Syrian city of Ugarit. For the 13th century, the Hittite archives preserve multilingual treaties with Egypt, Mitanni, and a patchwork of lesser kings. Ashurbanipal's Nineveh half a millennium later would inherit that same habit of recording, international agreements on clay, and tucking them into palace rooms. When you start reading the words, something else becomes obvious. Everyone is speaking in a script they already know. Hittite treaties, for example, are strikingly formulaic. A typical text from Hattusa will begin with an elaborate preamble. These are the words of the son, the great king, the king of Hatti, followed by the name of the vassal king. A historical prologue narrates how the great king took pity on this ruler, placed him on the throne of his fathers, rescued him from his enemies. Then come the stipulations, what the vassal must and must not do, followed by long lists of divine witnesses and curses for disobedience. When you lay several of these treaties side by side, patterns jump out. Whole paragraphs repeat almost unchanged. Formulas, curse lists, standard assurances of friendship and brotherhood show up again and again. The names change. The basic structure does not. That is not an accident. Formula made the documents legible within a shared diplomatic culture. Scribe in Hattusa and one in Ugarit. Both trained on ASEAN models knew what to speak good words of the king, or to be at peace and in brotherhood forever meant as legal phrases. They also kept negotiations within familiar grooves. If every treaty uses the same curse section, you do not need to argue about which gods will punish a rebel. They are already on the list. Flip side is that those same formula smooth over the rough edges of what was actually happening. In the text, a vassal freely swears loyalty on the ground. That oath may have been extracted after a military defeat. Under the shadow of occupying troops, clause about sending troops whenever the great king calls reads as mutual defense. In practice, might bind one party to supply soldiers for distant Hittite campaigns that offered them little in return. Letters between kings behave similarly. The Amarna tablets from Egypt's short-lived capital are full of standardized greetings to the king, my brother. Thus says the king of Hatti, brother, for me all is well. For you may all be well, for your household, your wives, your sons, your chariots, your troops, your country may all be very well. Variants of this string of wishes appear dozens of times. Inside that envelope of politeness, you occasionally glimpse strain. King complains that the last shipment of gold was too small. Another notes acidly that the horses sent as a royal gift were not up to proper standards. A vassal anxiously protests his loyalty, which usually means someone has accused him of plotting with a rival, but the language available for expressing those tensions is constrained by no one writes. You invaded my border province last year, and I am furious. Hittite text might instead note that the land which my lord the sun entrusted to me has been disturbed, and politely request investigation. Euphemism and indirection are not just politeness. They are survival strategies in a world where every line could in theory be read aloud in a royal court. The archives capture this polished surface very well. They are excellent at preserving what we might call official positions, what a treaty claimed to be about, how a vassal was supposed to speak of his overlord, what kings wanted on record about their relationships. They are much less good at capturing private motives or popular reactions. We do not have in clay conversations in palace corridors before a treaty was finalized. We do not hear the grumbling of local elites, who resented being bound by Hittite or Egyptian obligations. We almost never see outright dissent in writing, because the people whose words got baked into tablets were precisely those invested in presenting a stable, loyal, legitimate front. Even when fear and coercion are present, the formulas tend to fold them back into familiar shapes. Vassal, who has just survived a Hittite punitive campaign, may be forced to swear, "If I do not keep the oath of the king, may the 1,000 gods of Hatti destroy me." The violence that made that oath persuasive does not need explaining. Formula takes over and says everything and nothing at once. Another layer of silence comes from how unevenly these records survive. That famous treaty between Ramesses II of Egypt and Hattuseli III of Hatti, often called the earliest peace treaty, is preserved in both kingdoms. The Egyptian version was carved on temple walls in hieroglyphs. The Hittite version survives in Ardian, on clay from Hattusa. The two are similar enough that we can align them, but even here, small differences of emphasis creep in. Each side highlights what flatters its own king. From many Hittite agreements with Syrian or Anatolian rulers, we have only the Hittite copy. From the letters in the Amarna archive, we mostly have what foreign kings wrote to the Egyptian court, because the Egyptians kept incoming correspondence. The outgoing copies stayed in the foreign capitals, and those archives burned, eroded, or were simply never excavated. Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh likely contained its own sets of treaties, and international letters copied as models and precedents. The opposing files in Babylon, Elam, or Urartu have left us far fewer tablets. L's 3rd millennium BCE archive preserves a strikingly early web of treaties and gift exchanges, but almost none of the partner cities' paperwork has survived to balance it. This one-sidedness matters. When we read a vassal oath from Hattusa, we hear Hatti speaking about loyalty. We do not hear the vassal's own scribes describing the same relationship, perhaps with different emphasis, different justifications to their own population. When we read a king asking Egypt for much gold, "For in my land gold is like dust," we rarely have the Egyptian reply to see how that request was received. So what does refuse to record mean in this diplomatic context? In part, it is about choice of register. People involved in tense negotiations could have spoken very bluntly in private tablet. That reaches the archive is the cleaned-up version, run through the scribe's training in proper formulas. Open threats turn into appeals to friendship. Stark admissions of weakness turn into stock phrases about illness or disturbance in the land. It is also about purposeful ambiguity. Treaties often leave room for interpretation. Border is defined with reference to rivers and mountains whose exact courses and names could shift clauses about mutual aid, can be read narrowly or broadly, depending on later convenience. Writing things down did not end argument. It gave future kings a text they could quote selectively. And finally, it is about simple absence. Not every draft letter, every verbal agreement, Every insult traded through messengers ever reached the shelves. Scribes chose what to copy onto durable clay. Palace officials decided what mattered for future reference. When fires came to Ebola, to Hattusa, to Nineveh, only those selected documents were accidentally fired into permanence. Conflict, resentment, improvisation, regret. The textures of international life were there, but much of that stayed in speech, in gesture, in perishable media like wax tablets or papyrus, or in archives that have not survived. The clay holds the communicates that people expected to be reread, often by audiences far beyond the original sender and receiver. It is a record of how states wanted to talk about their relationships between the carefully repeated lines, the oaths of brotherhood, the promises to love only the king of Hatti, ritual invocations of peace forever. There are gaps where other voices might have been. Tablets do not so much lie as narrow the beam of light. What we see very clearly are the official words that could be baked, stored, and eventually burned into survival. What we do not see may be just as important, but it lived in a medium clay was never meant to hold. When we talk about what the tablets refuse to say, it is easy to imagine some ancient censorship committee, kings deciding what may or may not be written, priests policing the margins. That certainly happened. But there is another kind of refusal that has nothing to do with intention and everything to do with modern limits. A refusal produced by time, mud, paperwork, and the sheer arithmetic of clay. Across the Near East, from southern Iraq to central Turkey to northern Syria, there are still tens of thousands of tablets sitting where they fell 3,000, 4,000, even 5,000 years ago. Some are in collapsed rooms that have not yet been reached by archaeologists. Others have been exposed by erosion, seen once in a survey, then buried again, or carried off by lutters. Even in well-known sites like Nineveh or Hattusa, vast areas of palace complexes remain unexcavated. Every new trench has the potential to open another archive room. This creates a simple bottleneck. There is more text in the ground than there are trained teams, seasons, and budgets to retrieve it. And excavation is only the beginning. Once a crate of tablets leaves a site, a second bottleneck starts. Clay is tougher than papyrus, but it is still fragile. Many tablets were only partially fired by ancient disasters. They crumble if they dry too quickly, or if salts crystallize on their surfaces. So for every dramatic photograph of tablet-laden shelves in a museum basement, there are months or years of quiet conservation work, desalination baths, slow-drying consolidation, with reversible chemicals. Then there is documentation. In the early decades of Assyriology, tablet might be drawn once, hand-copied and published. Today, the standard is much higher. High-resolution photography, infrared imaging, sometimes 3D scanning or reflectance, transformation imaging that lets scholars relight the surface digitally from any angle. Each tablet has to be numbered, measured, photographed on all sides, and entered into a catalogue. For a single archive room from Ebla or Hattusa, that can mean thousands of individual records. All of this takes time, and it piles up. Modern wars and political instability add more delays. There are boxes of tablets from excavations in the 1960s and 1970s at sites like Mari Nimrud or Tel Leilan that have only been partially processed. In some cases, we know the rough contents from excavation notes, administrative texts, letters, ritual tablets. The detailed work of reading and publishing them has not yet happened. Even when a tablet has a museum number and a set of photographs, another distinction comes into play, one that is easy to miss from the outside: decipherment versus addition. Cuneiform as a script has been broadly deciphered for more than a century. Proto-cuneiform from Euro is harder, but many signs can still be read, or at least matched to known sign values. A trained specialist can sit down with a typical Old Babylonian, Neo-Assyrian, or Hittite tablet and identify the signs line by line. That does not mean the text is known. Post a full scholarly edition of it, more than just transliterating the wedges into Latin letters. It involves checking sign shapes against lists, proposing readings where the surface is damaged, comparing this tablet to similar texts from other sites, identifying personal names, toponyms, and technical terms. Notes have to be written to explain uncertainties. Parallel passages in other languages may have to be consulted. All of this then needs to be turned into something that other people can use. A printed article, a monograph, or a digital edition in a database like the cuneiform, digital, library initiative, or Athenergy portal mines for one long legal document or one complex ritual. That process can take months of a specialist's time. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of tablets, around 30,000 from Ashurbanipal's Nineveh, alone roughly 17,000 from Ebla, tens of thousands from various levels at Uruk, several tens of thousands more from Hattusa and satellite Hittite sites, and you can see the scale of the backlog. Many tablets are technically legible to someone with the right training, but they exist only as inventory numbers and a line or two in excavation reports. They are undeciphered in practice because their contents have never been fully edited, translated, and folded into the larger story. Then there is the problem of fragmentation. Fires that saved archives also shattered them. Walls collapsed on shelves. Roof beams crashed down onto heaps of soft clay. When archaeologists uncover a burnt archive room in Hattusa or Nineveh, they do not find neat stacks of books. They find layers of fragments. A single original tablet may now exist as a dozen pieces scattered through different trays, even different museums. Working out which pieces belong together is called joining. Some joins are obvious. Two edges with matching breaks, the same line of text continuing. Others are subtle. A corner with 3 lines of a Neo-Assyrian omen text in London might actually connect to a fragment in Berlin, excavated decades later from the same room. Scholars have literally walked museum storerooms with photographs and magnifying lenses, searching for joins by hand. Modern tools help. Digital databases let researchers search for identical strings of signs across thousands of tablets. So if 2 fragments preserve overlapping parts of the same line, software can flag a possible match. Reflectance imaging can bring out faint signs that were previously invisible, allowing broken pieces to be read more fully and compared. Experimental AI systems are being trained to suggest joins based on break patterns, sign spacing, and curvature. But again, this all takes time. For successful join can suddenly change what a tablet says. A text once thought to be a short incantation might turn out to be one part of a much longer ritual when its fragments are reunited. An economic account that seemed isolated may click into a larger ledger that reveals how an entire palace managed its grain. For you looking in from the outside, this means the archive is not a fixed object. It is growing, but in slow motion. Each field season, each conservation lab, each digital imaging project adds new readable words. Newly published edition of a tablet from Ebla or Nineveh or Hattusa can nudge interpretations of earlier texts or overturn old assumptions entirely. A king's reign that once seemed well documented may suddenly gain a new treaty, a new list of officials, a new omen series copied in his time. So when historians or popular accounts talk about what these archives show what Ebla was really like, what Ashurbanipal knew, what Uruk's first scribes cared to record, it is worth remembering that much of the material evidence is still in flux. Not because the past is changing, but because our sample of it is. Thousands of tablets remain unread, not because they are in an unknown script, because they are unexcavated, unconserved, unphotographed, unjoined, or simply unedited. Our reconstructions rest on the small fractions that has made it all the way through that pipeline. Any firm conclusion drawn from that fraction comes with an invisible asterisk. Valid so far given what has been dug up, glued back together, painstakingly copied. The library that fire preserved is still being opened shelf by shelf, shard by shard. Its silences may yet shrink or deepen as more of its clay finally begins to speak. Before any of that clay passes through our modern bottlenecks, it has already gone through 3 older filters. The first filter is what anyone bothered to put on clay in the first place. Writing was expensive, not in silver, but in labor and training. A scribe in Uruk around 3200 B.C.E., or in Ebla around 2350 B.C.E., or in Nineveh, under Ashurbanipal, around 650 B.C.E. represented years of education. You do not spend that resource casually. You deploy it where the palace, the temple, the court, thinks writing will give them leverage. So what gets written? Accounts, not anecdotes. In the proto-form archives of Uruk, we have thousands of numerical notations, recording barley, beer, labor, rations, deliveries of livestock. One level at Uruk yields room after room of small tablets, listing quantities and commodities, with personal names as pays or officials. What we do not have is the scribe's note that today the beer was bad and everyone complained. Omens, not experiments. In Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, whole shelves were devoted to omen series. Liver omens, celestial omens, birth omens. These texts list in excruciating detail what it means if a sheep's liver has a notch here, a blemish there. If Jupiter appears near a particular star, if a child is born with an extra finger, they are attempts to systematize the cosmos. What we do not see in that same format are records of failed trials. No cuneiform equivalent of, "We tried this ritual 3 times and nothing happened, so we changed it." Treaties, not rumors. Hattusa preserves copies of international agreements, parity treaties with Egypt and Mitanni, vassal treaties binding Syrian cities to the Hittite king. These are carefully phrased, witnessed, sealed documents. Somewhere in those same palaces, people gossiped about whether a vassal king was loyal, whether a prince was plotting a coup. That chatter almost never made it into formal archives. Letters sometimes hint at it. Complaints, accusations, veiled warnings. But the archive is weighted toward what could be declared, not what was only suspected. That selectivity alone can look like refusal. But then a second filter steps in. What institutions chose to keep? Not every written tablet was archival. In the houses of merchants at Kanesh in Anatolia, many small notes and draft letters seem to have been discarded when no longer needed, tossed into fill or reused as building material. In palaces, scribes produced practice tablets, temporary day notes, ephemeral calculations. Most of that never entered a storeroom. It was wiped, reused, or left to dry and crumble. Ebler's great archive of around 17,000 tablets did not preserve everything the city ever wrote. Preserved what at the moment of destruction was sitting in storerooms that the palace regarded as permanent. Canonical literary texts, diplomatic archives, administrative ledgers still relevant to ongoing management. Even within those rooms, choices were made over decades. Some older administrative texts were recopied into summary ledgers. The originals might be discarded. Some treaties were archived. Others, perhaps deemed minor or obsolete, were not. Institutions could also decide what not to keep. This is where censorship shades in, not as a hidden cabal, some echestes, but as routine gatekeeping. If your job is to maintain dynastic legitimacy, you may not rush to archive documents that undermine it in royal inscriptions from across Mesopotamia. Kings present themselves as chosen, victorious, pious. When a king usurps the throne, he tends to explain it as divine will, not as a coup. We rarely see official texts carefully preserving the arguments of his rivals. Ephemeral letters might contain sharp complaints. Archives of state tend to tilt toward the winning narrative. At Hattusa, later Hittite kings sometimes copied and preserved edicts of earlier rulers, but they also issued new versions that quietly revised history, adjusted succession order, or reinterpreted treaties. The earlier text might be filed away in a less accessible space, or not recopied at all time. What was easiest to reach and quote became the official memory. Religious orthodoxy worked the same way, but slowly. Ashurbanipal proudly claimed he had gathered all the tablets of the lands for his library. Yet that library is not a neutral amplice of Assyrian thought. It tilts heavily towards standard omen, canonical epics, authoritative ritual prescriptions. We have vanishingly little from heterodox cults, local experiments, private devotional practices of ordinary people. Were such texts never written or simply never invited into a royal collection that imagined had itself as an encyclopedic standard? In Ebla's ritual texts, certain gods appear frequently, others in the region are almost invisible. That may reflect genuine local priorities. It may also mean that when palace scribes selected which rituals to canonize, they favored cults with political backing and ignored marginal ones. A host, we have to be cautious here. There is a temptation to see every gap as proof of suppression. The absence of a rebellious poem in Ashurbanipal's library does not prove it ever existed. The lack of frank discussions of sexual practices in Hittite law codes does not prove a secret ban on such topics. Sometimes material is missing because no one considered it worth writing on durable clay. Social norms can discourage topics without leaving a neat paper trail of edicts. And then a third filter arrives, the most indifferent and brutal of all. What disasters chose to preserve? Fires that burned Ebla around 2350 BCE, Nineveh in 612 BCE, Hattusa around 1200 BCE did not burn evenly. Some rooms collapsed inward, protecting their contents. Others burned too hot, shattering tablets. 3 shelves near doors might be overturned and crushed by falling masonry. Niches deep in interior walls could be spared. Clay in an archive annex might be only partially baked, and then later dissolve in groundwater, while the main room's tablets vitrified into near ceramic and survived. This means that even within what scribes wrote and institutions stored, we possess a fire-edited subset. If by chance, the Ebla room that held delicate waxed writing boards for internal memoranda burned differently from the clay tub room, the internal politics of Ebla may have vanished while its ledgers survived. If one wing of Ashurbanipal's library, perhaps containing more recent or experimental compositions, was in an area more thoroughly looted or eroded, our sense of Assyrian literature is skewed toward what the flames happened to spare. Put these 3 filters together, and you get something that can feel like intention even when it is not. We look at Uruk's proto-cuneiform tablets and see no myths, no love songs, almost no voice. We infer a culture obsessed with rations and grain. Maybe the earliest scribes really were that focused, or maybe stories, jokes, and emotions lived mostly in perishable media. Spoken words, painted walls, wooden writing boards that did not pass through the clay bottleneck. We read the royal collections at Nineveh and see standardized omen series and epics. We infer a civilization devoted to divination and traditional literature. That is partly true. It is also what a king trying to claim mastery of inherited knowledge wanted on his shelves from outside, tempting to accuse the library of refusing to record dissent, private life women's voices, failed revolts, everyday skepticism. Some refusal probably did happen. Taboo topics, ritual secrets, certain sexual acts, direct blasphemy may have been discouraged from formal inscription. Dynasties and priesthoods surely shaped which stories were recopied and which quietly faded. The evidence rarely lets us point to a specific text and say with confidence this was suppressed. More often we see patterns of presence and absence and have to entertain multiple possibilities: selection bias, institutional priorities, ordinary disinterest, material loss, accidental destruction. Modern expectations make this harder. We are used to archives as places where everything is kept: mails, drafts, confidential reports. We imagine a library as a neutral space where knowledge accumulates. Ancient archives were not like that. Tools, instruments of governing, worship, and scholarly prestige. They were built to serve the needs of palaces and temples, not the curiosity of future historians. So when we say that the world's oldest archives refuse to record certain things, we should hear the question mark. Did the tablets decline to speak about some parts of ancient life because kings and priests actively silenced them, because scribes simply never thought to set those things in clay, or because the few tablets that once touched those subjects sat in the wrong room? The fire came. In many cases, we cannot yet tell whether there was a true refusal or whether the library we wish for never existed in clay at all. So what realistically may be gone forever? The most obvious category is the one we can barely see at all the writing that never came near a lump of clay. When we talk about library at Ebla or Nineveh or Hattusa, we instinctively picture shelves of tablets. But in every one of those places, scribes also wrote on perishable materials, wooden boards coated in wax, tied together like a notebook, strips of leather. In later centuries, papyrus imported from Egypt. We know this not because the boards themselves survive, but because the tablets keep glancing at them. Some Ella tablets explicitly mention their own status as copies made from older documents. Some Neo-Assyrian letters from Nineveh refer to tablets of wood being sent or kept elsewhere. Hittite inventories from Hattusa list writing boards among palace equipment. In Egypt, where the climate is kinder, actual wooden and papyrus documents show up alongside clay. There's no reason to think Mesopotamia and Syria were any different in their habits, only in their preservation. Wood, wax, leather, papyrus all burn and rot in ways clay does not. In a palace fire, a wooden writing board might charcoal fall as blackened dust onto the floor. Later, when rains seep through the ruined walls, that dust washes away. A clay tablet beside it, baked hard by the same flames, can sit there for 3,000 years and wait for an archaeologist's tell. So when we look at a tablet from Nineveh that summarizes legal decisions or lists the provisions for a ritual, it may be the tip of an iceberg. Below the surface, invisible to us, were working copies, drafts, case notes, internal memoranda, written on media designed for convenience, not eternity, not through censorship, but chemistry. Then there is everything that was never written at all. Ebla gives us some fragments of hymns and incantations. Nineveh preserves great epics like Gilgamesh. Hattusa has ritual scripts that read almost like plays. But the bulk of storytelling, praise, insult and memory traveled by mouth, even in literate corpse. The most powerful narratives were probably sung, not inscribed. Victory songs after a battle, laments after a famine, jokes about greedy officials, family histories recited during ancestor rituals. Whole epics could live for centuries in the memories of bards. Before anyone tried to fix a version in writing, we suspect this, partly because when written versions do appear, they already feel mature. The old Babylonian Gilgamesh tablets from around 18800 BCE refer casually to episodes, apps that are only fully preserved in much later copies. Hittite ritual texts sometimes allude to ancient words that must be spoken exactly as received, plying a chain of oral transmission older than the tablet in front of us. Most of those chains snapped, without leaving a trace behind every written myth we can read. There were probably cousins and rivals that never touched clay. Local creation stories from small satirical riffs on royal propaganda, regional variants of God's adventures that never became canonical enough to attract a scribe's attention. In that sense, the libraries we celebrate may have frozen only one branch of a great living tree of stories, while the rest decayed quietly in unrecorded speech. Sight loss adds another level of disappearance. Ebla, Nineveh, Hattusa, Great Uruk levels. These are famous because they were found, excavated, and to varying degrees documented. But the ancient Near East is dotted with tells and ruined mounds that have never been dug or were disturbed long before archaeologists arrived. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Lutters and early explorers pulled tablets out of sites, with almost no record of where exactly they came from. Thousands of ununiform tablets in museums and private collections today have no secure archaeological context. Their texts can still be read, but their original relationships to specific rooms, to neighboring tablets, to layers of destruction, are gone. Context is a kind of invisible information. At Ebla, the fact that certain tablets were found stacked on shelves, while others lay scattered in fallen debris, tells us about how the archive was arranged when the fire hit. At Hattusa, clustering of languages in particular rooms helps us see how scribes organized diplomatic versus ritual versus administrative texts. Remove that context, and you lose patterns. Looting does exactly that. A room once lined with shelves might be tunneled into tablets, scooped out and sold piecemeal, Some end up in Istanbul, some in London, some in a private collection in New York. Decades later, scholars can publish each tablet, but the spatial logic of the archive, the intellectual architecture of that library, is irretrievably scrambled, even in well-excavated sites. The gaps are obvious if you know where to look. At Nineveh, Ashurbanipal's library came with its own kind of table of contents. Catalogue tablets listing titles of works, and sometimes their opening lines, catalogues. Sometimes name compositions for which no surviving copy has yet been identified. In other cases, we have tablet 2 and IV of a series, but not I or 3. At Hattusa, we can see numbering systems that jump abruptly. Lines and colophons hint at earlier or later tablets that have simply not turned up. What do we do with those absences? One cautious move is to take them as minimum evidence. If a catalogue from Nineveh lists a treatise on a certain plant, we can infer that such a treatise once existed. If a Hittite ritual tablet refers to the words previously written on the wooden board, we can infer a hybrid practice. Some parts fixed in clay, others living on perishable media. But it is a mistake to treat every missing item as a lost revelation. There is a popular temptation to imagine that for every preserved epic, there must have been 3 more that were suppressed, that the empty shelves of Nineveh are full of banned doctrines. The evidence we have is more mundane. Catalogues generally show more of the same. Additional omen series, further commentaries, variant ritual prescriptions, regional myths. Fascinating, yes. Worlds shattering? Probably not. Here is one way to hold the mystery without tipping into conspiracy. Assume that what is missing would have complicated our picture, not overturned it. More medical recipes might show Mesopotamian healers were more experimental than we thought. They would still be working within a framework of gods, demons, and humors. More local myths from Syria might enrich our sense of how people imagined their gods, but they would still sit in a landscape of competing city cults, royal patronage, and regional politics. Speculation has its place, as long as we keep the labels clear. Or it is reasonable to imagine that somewhere in the missing portions of Ashurbanipal's library, there were texts giving more direct voice to women, provincial priests, to skeptical scholars who doubted certain omens. It is plausible that yet unfound rooms at Hattusa held more correspondence from vassal kings, more frustrated reports from border governors. It is tempting to picture lost notebooks in Uruk, where early scribes practiced not only numbers, but perhaps early experiments in narrative. It is also possible that we are already seeing the upper bound of what those institutions thought worth encoding in durable form. Household rituals transmitted from grandmother to granddaughter and performed for centuries in courtyards that left no archives at all. Archives like Ebla, Nineveh, Uruk, Hattusa let us glimpse how some palaces tried to fix the world in writing. What is gone forever is the much larger universe of things that never needed clay to exist, and so could vanish without a trace when their last practitioners died. In the next part, we will try something harder, not just naming these absences, but listening to them, asking what the shape of the silence itself can still tell us about the worlds those fires did to not preserve. So what does that silence actually sound like when we lean in? One way to hear it is to walk in your mind through the 4 archive worlds we'll breathe them visiting, and notice not only what's on the shelves, but what's missing between them. Uruk, around 3300 BCE, gives us the faintest voice, a city of tens of thousands of people, religious and economic center on the Euphrates, and what survives from its earliest scribes is almost aggressively narrow clay tablets, with columns of numbers, grain in, grain out, sheep, beer, labor days, proto-cuneiform signs that track rations and obligations, but say almost nothing about what any of this felt like. The system is astonishingly sophisticated, hundreds of distinct signs, numerical notations that anticipate later sexes' math, standardized ways of recording commodities. Yet there are no narrative myths, no royal boasts, no personal letters from this earliest phase. Uruk's first archive recorded the flows of an economy, but it did not, as far as we can see, record the inner life of the people who made that economy run. Then jump forward 1,000 years and a few hundred kilometers to Ebla. Here the silence is different. Ebla's archive, buried somewhere around 2300 BCE, suddenly speaks in sentences. We get kings' names, the names of queens and princes, the names of cities up and down Syria and into Mesopotamia. We see diplomatic marriages, cargoes of silver and timber, lists of offerings to gods, whose cults flicker briefly into view and then are gone. But even at Ebla, the archive prefers some voices to others. We hear the court, not the street. Royal decrees, not local gossip. Almost all the personal names we can see belong to men. Tablets tell us which gods received which sheep, but they are almost completely silent about how a farmer's family actually worshipped those gods. Courtyard shrine, when fire swept the palace, those tablets baked and waited for us. The flames preserved the bones of the archive, but the flesh, the gestures, songs, hesitations that surrounded those documents burned away. Hattusa, centuries later in central Anatolia, quieter in some respects and louder in others. The Hittite capital left us around 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. We have ritual scripts so detailed they tell a priest which hand to use and where to spit. We have treaties and vassal lists in Hittite, Akkadian, Huran, Lurian. We have bilingual and trilingual glossaries that show royal scribes painstakingly mapping words between languages. What we hardly have are the reactions to those rituals and treaties. Hattusa's archive tells us what should happen. According to court and temple, it is almost mute on what did happen when orders met weather, distance, and human stubbornness. There are a few letters of complaint, few reports of disobedient vassals, but we are mostly hearing the instructions, not the improvisations. And then Nineveh in the 7th century B.C.E., where Ashurbanipal's library tried to gather all the tablets of the lands. This is the richest voice we have. 20,000 tablets and fragments. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Omen series with tens of thousands of entries, medical recipes, lexical lists, letters from generals on distant frontiers. The king's scribes copied older compositions, imported texts from Babylon, and created commentaries that read like early scholarship. But even here, the selectivity is stark. The library is heavy on what Ashurbanipal valued: scholarly lore, omens, rituals, royal ideology. There are almost no documents about everyday city governance. The markets of Nineveh, their haggling and cheating and noise, are almost invisible. So are most of the women, the enslaved, the foreigners passing through, whose names never reached royal shelves. When Babylonian and Median armies burned Nineveh in 612 BCE, that fire turned a working royal repository into a time capsule. It froze Ashurbanipal's intellectual world in mid-gesture, but any tablets stored elsewhere in wood and leather burned without leaving traces. Any stories that never interested a court scholar simply disappear from the record. Across all 4 sites, the same pattern holds. Destruction, paradoxically, preserves the most durable objects while erasing the wider web of meaning that once made them make sense. Fires at Ebla and Nineveh baked tablets but vaporized wooden boards. The final abandonment of Hattusa left tablets scattered on floors, divorced from their shelves, and catalog systems. Uruk's earliest levels survive as rubble, and fills just enough tablets to show us what proto-cuneiform could do, and almost nothing of what it chose not to do. We look at this and say Uruk refused to record stories, or none refused to preserve descent. Sometimes that refusal was an active choice. Scribes decides what belonged on eternal clay and what stayed transient. Sometimes it was just physics and chance. What clay tolerated wood and memory did not. So where does that leave us? Maybe with questions more than answers. If a future archaeologist dug up the remains of our own information world after some catastrophe, what would they see? Hard drives turned to unreadable sludge, paper rotted, plastic warped. Would only inscriptions carved into stone monuments survive? Maybe a handful of engraved plaque bits of metal signage, few printed books sealed by accident in dry, protected places. From that debris, what picture would they draw of us? Which of our arguments, jokes, fears, and small kindnesses would still be legible? Which whole genres would vanish so completely that their absence couldn't with fears? Damning even be guessed at closer to home. If you had to decide what one box of your life could go into the fire, be hardened, wait for someone 4,000 years from now, what would you put in it? What would you be willing to have stand for your world, knowing how much it will leave unsaid? Tap like if this helped you unwind. Subscribe if you'd like to be here for the next excavation. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Because every time you do, you leave a little inscription in this shared, fragile archive we're making together. One more trace that says quietly pass that you were here.